Chapter 461, Departure for the World Cup. The British Ministry of Magic had thrown itself headlong into preparing for the Quidditch World Cup final. As Mrs. Weasley reminded Sirius Black in her letter, this event was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the British wizarding community. After all, it had been 30 years since Britain last lifted the cup. For an old magical power, that drought was nothing short of humiliating. Even if Britain didn't field a team this year, as partial hosts, they were determined to demonstrate first-class organization and leave no room for ridicule. With that in mind, the ministry devised a simple but ambitious plan. First, they scouted out a remote, uninhabited bog to serve as the stadium, then swathed the area in Muggle detection charms and perimeter wards to prevent any accidental sightings. It may sound straightforward, but with such a small staff, merely securing and enchanting the site demanded more manpower than anything they'd attempted since Sirius Black's escape from Azkaban. Yet everyone agreed, if the cup was going to return to British soil, they would make this World Cup final the most memorable one ever. Second, we'll stagger the arrival times of the live audience at our designated gathering point. By scheduling spectators to arrive at different intervals, we'll smooth out crowd flow and ease congestion at the reception area. This approach also lets us roll out tiered ticket pricing. Attendees with economy tickets will be required to arrive 2 to 3 weeks before the event, while premium ticket holders enjoy later and more convenient arrival windows. Third, we'll diversify travel methods. A limited number of wizards may use Muggle buses and trains, but we'll keep those slots to a minimum. After all, many wizards have little grasp of how Muggles live day to day, and unleashing too many of us onto public transit, especially with visitors arriving from around the world, could quickly become chaotic. Naturally, seasoned wizards can still apparate, but only into a handful of carefully chosen safe zones. This ensures they remain hidden from Muggle eyes and maintains the statute of secrecy. They had already taken this into account when scouting venues for the competition. A secluded grove near the main grounds was designated as the apparition landing point, ensuring our group could arrive and depart without any chance of Muggle interference. For anyone unable or unwilling to apparate, the ministry would provide port keys. These enchanted objects could whisk dozens of wizards instantly from one spot to another within a prearranged time window, perfect for moving a large group all at once, discreetly and efficiently. Cornelius Fudge had remarked with no little pride that Britain would deploy 200 port keys for this event, a scale of readiness not seen in years. As Sirius finished his briefing, Sherlock and the two companions exchanged satisfied nods. It was clear the ministry had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure everything ran smoothly, and that the competition remained strictly under the radar of the non-magical world. The closest port key is at the Ministry of Magic, Hermione explained as they approached the grand, columned entrance. It's reserved for ministry staff, and apparently Fudge is determined that everyone should see you and Harry arrive together at the match. Fine by me, Sirius shrugged. As long as it gets us a good spot, I don't mind placating the minister. Almost on cue, 2 black cars rolled up the stone driveway. From the first stepped Harry and Sirius, greeted instantly by a beaming Cornelius Fudge. Harry, Sirius, splendid to see you two. Celebrating a bit early, aren't you? Sirius interrupted with a smirk. Fudge's grin faltered for a heartbeat before he straightened his robes and regained composure. Not to worry. Everything is perfectly arranged. Just follow me. He bowed politely to Sherlock and Hermione, who had emerged from the same car as Harry and Sirius, before turning to the second vehicle. As Ron, Ginny, Fred, and George tumble, Ed out, Fudge's jaw dropped and his eyes went wide. The sight of the Weasley clan had clearly taken him by surprise. Fudge stared in astonishment at the familiar shock of red hair. Wait, aren't those Weasley children? Why are they here with you? In truth, Fudge couldn't have cared less about Arthur Weasley, the head of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office. Since its creation, the department had been seen as little more than a backwater, never enjoying the prestige or resources of the Misuse of Magic Artifacts Office. And although the Weasleys counted themselves among the Sacred 28, their reputation was hardly stellar. Above all, they were notoriously poor, especially compared to the other old pureblood families. Fudge still recalled Draco Malfoy's sneer on that first train ride to Hogwarts. Red hair, hand-me-down robes, and half a dozen kids to feed. But lately, the tide had begun to turn. Bill and Charlie had both graduated and found solid careers, and now Percy, once the dutiful third son, had finally secured a position at the Ministry. For the Weasleys, the hardest days were at last behind them. "Why do you think I asked the Ministry of Magic for 2 cars?" Sirius Black's tone was sharp as he fixed Cornelius Fudge with a pointed look. Fudge's face registered surprise, and then irritation. I didn't realize." Sirius cut him off. "Arthur's children are coming with us." Fudge's posture slumped into a stiff, apologetic bow. "Oh, of course. That makes perfect sense." He rummaged for a handkerchief, mopping his brow. "Really, this just shows how much I, as Minister for Magic, value the families of Ministry employees." Sirius let the insincere praise roll off him. He glanced around the courtyard, fuming inwardly at how Fudge's vanity had poisoned the entire department's morale. Just then, a Ministry clerk hurried up to Fudge, whispering urgent words in his ear. Fudge nodded curtly and turned to Sirius. "My apologies, but I have another engagement. I'll take my leave now. Please, you look after them." He beamed, offering Harry a strained fatherly smile, then swept off across the stone plaza, clutching his stomach as though he might be ill. "He acts like we're invisible," Fred Weasley muttered under his breath. "Not invisible," George corrected with mock solemnity. "We're officially the Weasley children." "He never expected us to turn up here with Uncle Black," Ginny snapped. "He thought we'd stay with Dad." "Ignore him," Sirius replied, brushing off her remark. He turned to the Ministry official Fudge had assigned to them. "Please show us the way," he said, his tone gentle. Earlier, the same employee had bristled at Sirius's lack of deference toward the minister. Now, relieved by Sirius's kinder manner, the wizard exhaled and offered, "Right this way, please." They followed him down a quiet corridor and into an empty office. To their surprise, the man waiting by the desk was an old acquaintance, Arnold Peacegood, the memory obliviator from the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad and Professor Flitwick's self-styled star pupil. He broke into a wide grin. "Sherlock, Harry, long time no see." Sirius raised an eyebrow. "You two know each other?" Harry returned the smile. "Yes, Mr. Peacegood. We crossed paths last month. Remember, the case at the docks?" Peacegood's eyes lit up with recognition, and he stepped forward to shake Harry's hand while Sherlock nodded in greeting. The reunion was cordial, if unexpected, and the mood in the room lightened considerably. Piers Polkiss, the same boy who'd accompanied us on last summer's Diagon Alley trip and even saw us off at King's Cross, now stepped forward and offered his hand to Sirius. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Black," he said with a practiced smile. "I'm Arnold Piers Polkiss. Minister Fudge asked me to escort you." Since they'd met before, Sirius kept his usual sarcasm in check. He shook Piers's hand and asked casually, "Which portkey are we using this time?" Piers reached behind him, produced a damp, scuffed boot, and waved it in the air. "This one. Let us count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 of us all together." "Perfect. Just touch the portkey with one finger, like this." Fred hooked his pinky around the worn boot and gave a soft sigh. "I'm so jealous of Bill, Charlie, and Percy." George bumped Fred on the shoulder. "They've all passed their apparition tests, so they can sleep in. Count yourself lucky. If we were still at the Burrow, we'd be up before dawn. You know there's no car waiting for us up there." Hermione reminded them as they stood in the chilly foyer of the Ministry. "We'll have to walk all the way up Stoteshed Hill." Fred grinned, sliding his arm around Harry's shoulders. "Then it's all thanks to Harry this time. We've never had the privilege of traveling by Ministry-issued vehicle before." Harry offered a small, somewhat nervous smile. It was his first time using a portkey, and despite appearances, his stomach was doing somersaults. Sirius caught his hesitation and clapped a reassuring hand on his back. "Don't worry, Harry. Portkeys are far more comfortable than apparition." "Really?" Harry asked, raising an eyebrow. "Absolutely," Sirius replied. "In fact, they can even be faster than flu powder, depending on the route." Harry let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and relaxed his shoulders. Nearby, Hermione's hand gripped Sherlock's arm so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her body trembled slightly, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Finally, she looked up at Sherlock's impassive face and asked, "Sherlock, aren't you at all nervous?" Sherlock gave her a cool, slightly bemused glance. Why should I be? His calm confidence only heightened Hermione's flutter of nerves, but she squared her shoulders and offered him a determined smile. Together, with Harry, Sirius, Fred, and the rest of their unlikely party, they prepared to step through the shimmering portkey and onto Stoatshed Hill. Didn't Sirius say it's much easier than apparition? Hermione asked, her voice quivering despite her attempt at bravado. That's what they say, but... Harry began, but Hermione cut him off. She gripped his arm so tightly her fingers went white. I read in a book that using a portkey feels like flying. Ron glanced at Sherlock and Harry. You two are so lucky you've already apparated with the adults, he said enviously. A portkey won't faze you. Ginny, too, looked pale with nerves. When she saw Hermione cling to Harry's arm, she did the same. Harry froze. 3 brothers and 2 were nearby. Why was Ginny hanging on him? He decided not to ask. Instead, he offered her a reassuring smile. Ginny's tension melted away. Harry, the little angel, Piers Polkiss, holding the bent metal portkey in one hand and a pocket watch in the other, leaned forward. All right, everyone ready? I'm activating it in 3, 2, 1. Before anyone could change their mind, Sherlock felt a tug in his gut, as if an invisible hook had caught him. His feet left the ground, and within seconds he was soaring upward, the world dropping away beneath him. Just as Sirius had promised, the sensation was unlike anything Sherlock had ever experienced, and far more comfortable than either apparition or flue powder. He could feel Harry on his left and Hermione on his right. Harry's shoulder pressed into his, and Hermione clung to his arm as though her life depended on it. They were truly flying, or at least that's how it felt, a headlong rush through a blur of air with nothing visible ahead. Oddly, Sherlock realized he wasn't consciously gripping anything. His index finger was stuck to the boot portkey as if it were magnetized. He counted the seconds in his head, 3, 2, 1, 3.5. Then, with a jarring thud, his feet hit solid ground. Ouch! Hermione gasped, stumbling into his arms. Sherlock frowned, took a half step back, and wrapped his arms around her to keep her upright. Harry wasn't so lucky. Ginny had one of his hands, but the moment his feet touched down, Ron tripped over him and sent him sprawling. The portkey boot clattered across the grass and came to rest beside Harry's head. Harry looked up. Only Sirius, Piers Polkiss, and Sherlock Holmes remained on their feet. Hermione, pale and trembling, leaned heavily against Sherlock's arm. Everyone else lay unconscious around them. A crisp voice crackled in Hermione's earpiece. 608, Ministry of Magic. At that signal, Harry wrenched himself free from the tangle of Ron and Ginny and hauled them both upright. Thank you, Harry, Ginny murmured, cheeks aflame at their close contact. Harry gave her a reassuring smile and nod, then swept his gaze over the scene. Thank you, Sherlock. Hermione slipped from Sherlock's support and sank to her knees, cheeks still burning. She managed a soft, thanks, that barely reached his ear. Sherlock said nothing. His cool, analytical eyes never left the perimeter, already plotting their next move. Chapter 63. Another expert? An old ministry insider, who insisted on remaining anonymous, once quipped, on one hand, the Ministry of Magic is overflowing with talent. On the other, it's a bit of a makeshift operation. Honestly, what's the first rule when you're planning a major event? Safety. Safety. And above all, safety. You draw up your proposals, you map out every conceivable emergency, and you shield every participant from harm. If you can't even guarantee the basics, you shouldn't be running the event. You might as well shut it down. So when Arthur Weasley casually explained that he's always been a little careless about safety, but since he's a former national team member, there was simply no one more enthusiastic to head the Department of Magical Games and Sports, Sherlock nearly laughed out loud. Praising the ministry's abundant talent had never sounded so deliciously ironic. Harry and Hermione, who knew Sherlock's temperament better than anyone, caught the sharp undertone of his remark and shared a knowing smile. Everything passed between them without a word. Mr. Weasley, however, seemed oblivious to the jab and simply nodded. Oh yes, Sherlock. The Ministry of Magic does have some very talented people, and they're always so polite. He rambled on, completely unaware of the irony, while Piers Polkiss eagerly backed him up. Sherlock shot them both a withering glare. At that point, Arthur Weasley and Arnold Peacegood the ministry's distinguished employees stepped forward to lead Sirius Black, who was bristling with contempt for the very institution he was being shown off to, and the young wizards. Sherlock brought up the rear as they made their way across the mist-shrouded grounds. As Mr. Roberts, the Muggle, had already observed, the gathering was enormous. 2 endless rows of tents stretched out before them, and the group was forced into a slow, winding procession through the dense crowd. "You can really tell someone put a lot of thought into making these look like Muggle campsites," Sirius said, strolling alongside Harry. He nodded toward a cluster of tents trimmed with garish paint and fake window shutters. "But those over there," he added, pointing at 3 especially elaborate ones, "they're going way too far, don't you think, Harry?" Despite being a pure-blood Black, Sirius had always had a soft spot for Muggles, a stance that cost him dearly among his own family. His best friend was James Potter, and James's wife, Lily, was Muggle-born. Through them, Sirius understood Muggle customs far better than even Mr. Weasley or his colleague Arnold Peasegood. It didn't take him long to spot when someone was gilding the lily. Arthur Weasley, beaming with pride, patted a nearby tent pole. "Oh, I think they're simply charming," he declared. "Beautiful little decorations, aren't they?" chimed in Arnold, adjusting his spectacles to get a better look. From Sirius's direction of gaze, Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione, all 3 raised in Muggle families, instantly grasped the problem. These tents weren't just painted. They'd been outfitted with mock chimneys, faux ropes, and even tiny weather vanes, features no ordinary camper would ever dream of installing. In trying so hard to mimic the Muggle experience, the owners had ended up producing something no Muggle would recognize at all. Sherlock didn't hesitate. "You've found the blind spot, Sirius." He glanced over the strange collection of tents arrayed before them. At least some looked like ill-fitting imitations of Muggle marquees, overdone but unmistakably human handiwork. Yet others had obvious magical enchantments woven into their very canvas, almost as if their owners feared no one would notice their splendor otherwise. No wonder that poor Muggle guard ended up so unsettled. Even Piers Pocus and Mr. Weasley, both seasoned Ministry of Magic officials, could only shake their heads in exasperation. Today, the display was simply unbearable. In the center of the site stood one tent more gaudy than the rest, dozens of yards of striped silk draped around it, earning the whole thing into a miniature palace rather than a simple pavilion. Live peacocks, tethered on golden stakes, strutted by its entrance. A little farther along, another tent soared 4 stories high, complete with turrets and crenellations. And closest to the main path, a third tent had gone so far as to install a formal garden. Bird baths, sundials, even trickling fountains framed its door. Sherlock folded his arms, eyebrows raised. "This is what happens when show-offs meet magic," he murmured. "No wonder Muggles find it all so baffling." Sherlock merely raised an eyebrow and said nothing. Harry and Hermione stood by in stunned silence, but the 4 Weasley children regarded the scene as perfectly ordinary. "It's always like this," one of them shrugged. Mr. Weasley, having recovered his composure, smiled broadly and addressed everyone. "Whenever the whole crowd shows up, someone has to make a grand entrance." He led them to the edge of the woods, where a little clearing lay before them. A crooked wooden post bore a hand-painted sign reading, "Weasley." "Looks like my name's been misspelled," Arthur chuckled, "but no matter. It doesn't get any better than this. Mistakes like that happen all the time. And look, the stadium's right on the other side of these trees. You're practically on top of it." "Suitable indeed," Sirius agreed, then turned his attention to Piers Pocus. The boy gave a faint, knowing smile and strolled a few yards deeper into the woods. There, in a far larger clearing, stood another sign planted firmly in the ground. Black. Mr. Weasley, who'd been brimming with confidence just moments before, suddenly felt a flush of self-consciousness. Luckily, no one dared tease him. He cleared his throat, shrugged off his backpack, and steered the conversation in a new direction. "All right, everyone, listen up. I've got an important rule." All eyes swung toward him as he spoke with unexpected gravity. "From now on, no magic." A chorus of objections rose instantly. "What? Why not?" Fred and George were the first to shout back. "Because we're on Muggle territory now. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. If we're going to pass as Muggles, we have to pitch the tent by hand. It can't be that hard. Muggles do it all the time. Weasley's face lit up in triumph, right up until Sherlock let out a long, exasperated sigh. He borrowed Sirius's backpack and strode over to the tent marked with the black crest. Rolling up his sleeves, he set to work. Hermione fell in beside him, crouching to help with the ropes. Meanwhile, Mr. Weasley, though eager to prove he could manage without magic, quietly admitted to himself that he'd never been much of a tent builder. When Mr. Weasley saw Harry lifting his foot to hurry off with Hermione towards Sherlock's side, a flash of panic crossed his face. Only 3 people in this crowd really understood Muggles, and if they all wandered away, he couldn't be left alone to manage the tent. Before Harry could take another step, Arthur Weasley gripped his arm firmly. "Hold on, Harry," he said. "Let's get this tent up first. Where do you think we should start?" Harry paused and wiped the sweat from his brow, surprised by the request. It wasn't that he didn't want to help, he just had no idea how to pitch a tent. During every holiday the Dursleys went on, they'd leave him with Mrs. Figg next door. And once Sirius was on the run, family outings ceased altogether. He'd been looking forward to proving himself, especially to Sherlock, as Hermione had urged, but he hadn't expected Mr. Weasley to turn to him for advice. "Please, Harry," Arthur added, his voice earnest. "I could really use your help here." Ginny clasped her hands and gave him a hopeful look. "Just tell us what to do, Harry. We'll follow your lead." Fred and George chimed in at the same time. "We're with you, mate." Ron tucked his hands into his pockets and smiled. "Count me in, too." With the entire Weasley clan now looking to him, Harry drew a steadying breath. All right, tent duty it was. Harry found himself in a bind. He was torn between helping Sherlock and pitching in with the Weasleys, and too embarrassed to abandon them entirely, so he stuck around to help. His Muggle schooling finally paid off. Though he'd never assembled a tent before, he quickly deciphered the poles and pegs from the instructions. Unfortunately, Mr. Weasley wasn't much help. Every time they needed the mallet, he'd rush over with unwarranted excitement and promptly get in everyone's way. By the 3rd time Harry shot him a frustrated look, Ginny stepped in. "Dad, why don't you take a break?" she suggested firmly, ushering him aside. With Mr. Weasley out of the way, their little team, led by Harry, worked like clockwork. Within minutes, they'd hauled up a perfectly serviceable, if slightly lopsided double tent. "Well done, Harry," exclaimed Mr. Weasley as he hurried back over, beaming. "I never doubted you could do it without magic." The group stepped back to admire their handiwork. Harry allowed himself a small, proud smile. No one would guess this tent had been raised by wizards. Just then, a familiar voice drifted over his shoulder. "Need a hand, brother?" Harry looked up at Sherlock's calm question, blinking in surprise. He'd been so absorbed in wrestling with their tent poles that he'd completely forgotten about Sherlock and Hermione. Now, following Harry's gaze, Ron stopped mid-stride, mouth agape. In the misty clearing behind Sherlock and Hermione stood not one but 2 tents, each with a perfectly straight frame and striped silk walls that gleamed in the morning light. Even the fanciful, largely decorative finials and pennants were positioned with meticulous care. In stark contrast, the double tent he and Ron had just muddled through looked downright shabby, its flapping canvas threatening to collapse at the faintest breeze. "Merlin's beard," Ron finally gasped. "We spent ages wrestling our one tent into the ground, and they've already put up 2? Harry ran a hand through his hair, equally astonished. "And they're not just quick, they're rock solid and beautiful, like a professional camping crew handled them." "Another expert," Ron whispered, eyes widening as he darted toward Sherlock and Hermione once more. Harry paused to watch them for a moment, then couldn't help but marvel. "Sherlock, Hermione, you two are real pros at this." Hermione's cheeks went pink. I only helped a little. Sherlock did almost everything." She wasn't being modest. Although she and her parents often went camping, she'd never actually pitched a tent herself. The instant she hesitated over where each pole and peg belonged, Sherlock was already snapping segments together. His hands moved with such confidence and speed that she dropped her own plans and simply followed his directions. For someone like Hermione, who usually led every project, choosing not to think was an oddly pleasant relief. Sirius Black and Piers Pocus looked on in admiration as Sherlock, aided by Hermione, had already raised one tent. Mr. Weasley, delighted by their progress, called them over to help with the second. With Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione working as an effortless golden trio, the second tent went up in no time at all. Harry had always been quick on the uptake, but few of his skills had ever been more welcome than today's. After Sherlock's initial instructions, Harry and Hermione, with the help of the 4 Weasley children, had managed to raise a brand new tent almost entirely on their own. They worked swiftly and smoothly, pausing only once or twice to cast a confirming glance at the perfect alignment of poles and the tautness of the canvas. By the time they finished, the tent stood proudly in the clearing, its sides straight and sturdy instead of leaning precariously like their last haphazard effort. It wasn't quite as flawless as the shelters Sherlock had built in moments, but to Harry and his friends, it represented a triumph, proof that they'd grown more competent, more confident. Harry wiped sweat from his brow, then let out a long, satisfied sigh. He remembered all too well the last time he'd pitched a tent, how it had lurched at the slightest breeze as though poised to collapse. That clumsy nightmare was gone. Today, guided by Sherlock's expertise and powered by their own determination, they'd outdone themselves. Harry paused, the glow of accomplishment in his eyes. He glanced over at Sherlock, who was casually stowing away the last of the spare pegs. Curiosity won out over pride. Harry stepped forward and asked, voice low but earnest, "Sherlock, how did you get so good at this? I mean, pitching tents. Do you and your aunt and uncle go camping often?" Harry asked, raising his eyebrows. "Quite the opposite, my dear Harry," Sherlock replied, turning and brushing dust from his hands with the casual air of someone brushing lint from a suit. "Aside from a trip to Hawaii earlier this year, I haven't traveled much. If your memory serves, you'll recall that when you first met my brother, he mentioned that before I turned 7, I'd visited France, the Netherlands, and Germany. Of course, a child that age isn't likely to make such journeys unaided. And no, I didn't pitch tents in Hawaii either. Like all of you, this is my first time doing it." Harry glanced at the 2 meticulously assembled tents, then back at Sherlock's slightly dusty, but at ease, hands. "First time? Then how did you?" His voice trailed off in disbelief. Hermione's eyes went wide, her lips parting as if to speak before she thought better of it. Ron simply gaped, his mouth forming a perfect O. Sherlock tilted his head, as unfazed as ever. "Isn't this common sense?" The air around them froze. The 3 friends exchanged stunned looks, each wondering what other quiet surprises their new companion might have in store. Chapter 464. "This is common sense," my friend Sherlock's offhand remark. "Erecting a tent is common sense, my friend," sent Mr. Weasley into an enthusiastic nod. His eyes practically sparkled. "Oh, so this is Muggle common sense? How marvelous!" Hermione exchanged a helpless look with Harry. "Sherlock, with all due respect, it really isn't. Even most adult Muggles have never handled a professional-grade tent before, let alone assembled one correctly on their very first try without any instructions." She couldn't help but glance at the Weasleys' crooked, half-finished shelter, stifling a sigh. Honestly, Harry had done a brilliant job under the circumstances. If she'd been in charge of coordinating the Weasley twins, Ron, Ginny, and her well-meaning but clumsy father, she doubted she'd have managed half as well. Harry offered a grateful grin and nodded in agreement. Absolutely. Back home, this wouldn't be called common sense at all. Ron threw up his hands in mock exasperation. "Honestly, Sherlock, if I didn't know wandless magic was impossible, I'd swear you slipped a silent spell in when none of us were looking." Meanwhile, Fred and George Weasley were crawling all over the 2 tents, their fingers tracing every seam and reinforcement. As budding inventors, deep in preparations for Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, they couldn't resist a hands-on mystery. How could 2 tents made from the same canvas behave so differently once erected? Ginny sat off to one side, her attention fixed entirely on Harry, and she took no part in the discussion. A small circle of onlookers had formed as well. Arthur Weasley stood next to Sirius Black and Piers Polkiss, all 3 watching Sherlock's calm demeanor with keen interest. Sensing their curiosity, Sherlock surveyed the group, then began in his precise, measured tone. "When I speak of common sense, I don't mean the little life hacks everyone already knows. I mean the underlying principles you can uncover through careful observation and logical deduction. If you examine these tents closely, you'll see they were conceived from the start with very deliberate design intentions. Intentions that reveal themselves in every stitch, every support pole, and every ventilation flap. Once you grasp those basic concepts, the differences cease to be mysterious. The poles form the tent's skeleton, the canvas shields us from wind and rain, and the guy ropes secure everything and maintain tension. Each joint obeys mechanical principles, so once you understand what every piece does and how it fits into the whole, assembling the tent becomes like solving a three-dimensional puzzle. Every panel has its own place and method of attachment. You must grasp the design logic rather than rely on guesswork. Sherlock strode over to the freshly pitched tent, Harry and Hermione's handiwork, and lightly tapped one of the straight poles. Just like this. When you know the principles and work together smoothly, the structure almost builds itself. Harry did exceptionally well. He picked up the essentials in no time. Harry nodded, absorbing Sherlock's words. Hermione, whose brow had been clouded with doubt only moments before, now stared at the tent with new appreciation. She murmured under her breath, "Structural analysis, breaking a task into functional modules." Indeed, this mirrors the way we deconstruct complex magical theories, even though the materials themselves are completely different, Sherlock concluded. Everyone but Harry and Hermione stared at him as though he were speaking gibberish. Sirius said nothing, and Piers Polkiss let out a disgruntled snort. "I see your point, Sherlock, but turning theory into practical skill so instantly still strikes me as uncanny." Meanwhile, Mr. Weasley was beside himself with excitement over Muggle engineering. Suddenly, as if a brilliant idea had just struck him, he slapped his forehead and bolted for the tent. Fred and George sprang forward and grabbed him in a vice-like grip. "Dad, please, no more hammer studies. The tent's pitched perfectly already." "Let me go, Mr. Weah," Slay laughed, shaking loose from their hold. "I just want to examine that knot." At the promise of inspecting only a knot, the twins at last released him, though they kept him in their sights to make sure he didn't go rummaging through their tools. And just then, Harry spotted another problem. Hermione, Sherlock, Sirius, and Harry were already sharing 2 tents, and that felt snug enough. But now Bill, Charlie, and Percy were on their way, bringing the Weasley party up to 8. Hermione glanced at Sherlock, puzzled, then turned to Harry with wide eyes. Sherlock merely smiled, saying nothing, and Hermione's face lit up as if she just pieced it together. Harry, however, blinked in confusion, still trailing behind Sherlock's quicksilver mind. At that moment, Mr. Weasley, having finally worked out the tent's seams, crawled into the first tent on all fours. His voice floated out, slightly muffled. It might be a bit cramped in here." Harry's heart sank. Might? It would definitely be tight. But before he could speak up, Mr. Weasley called, "Still, I reckon everyone can squeeze in. Come take a look." Harry opened his mouth to object, but Sherlock gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder and simply nodded toward the tent. Reluctantly, Harry followed the rest of the group around the tent's entrance, bracing himself for the squeeze. "Sherlock, go on in," he replied, ducking under the tent's flap. "And, before you say anything, just listen." Harry hesitated a moment, still unsure what he was stepping into, but his faith in Sherlock was absolute. He crouched, followed him inside, and stopped cold. Where he'd expected a cramped canvas shelter, he found himself in a spacious, old-fashioned 3-bedroom apartment, a cozy living room, a tidy kitchen, even a bathroom. He spun around, bewildered. This was no ordinary tent. It was enchanted, much like the Weasleys, flying Ford Anglia, its modest exterior belying a vast interior. Yet what struck him most was the decor. Threadbare armchairs draped with crocheted doilies, a faded Persian rug, and a heavy, unmistakable smell of cat urine in the air. Harry's eyebrows shot up. It was exactly like Mrs. Figg's house, the same dusty, cluttered charm. Mrs. Arabella Figg, the peculiar Muggle lady who lived just 2 streets away from 4 Privet Drive. He turned back to Sherlock, who simply raised an eyebrow as if saying, "Told you." Silence stretched between them for a moment, broken only by the faint padding of unseen paws. Then Sherlock leaned in conspiratorially. "Welcome to our new headquarters." Harry could only stare in astonishment. Whatever plan Sherlock had in mind, it was already proving far stranger and far more ingenious than he'd ever imagined. Every year on Dudley's birthday, the Dursleys treated him and a friend to a special outing, an amusement park adventure, a burger feast, or a trip to the movies. Inevitably, Harry was left behind in Mrs. Fig's care. At the time, Harry didn't yet know he was a wizard, he just knew he wanted to join in the fun. Blaming Mrs. Fig for keeping him cooped up, he never liked her. As he got older, Harry realized the truth. Even if Mrs. Fig had never existed, the Dursleys still wouldn't have taken him along. But first impressions die hard. On top of it, Mrs. Fig's house reeked of cabbage and cats, and she had an odd habit of making Harry admire photo albums filled with every feline she'd ever owned. Fortunately, all of that is behind him now. This past summer, Harry even managed to patch things up with the Dursleys, and for once, he actually went out with them. He rode roller coasters, devoured hamburgers, and sat through a movie or two. It felt almost normal. Harry sat quietly in the glow of the campfire, reflecting on how far his life had come. He now had friends like Sherlock Holmes, and just last month he'd spent a birthday doing real ordinary fun, rather like Dudley, out in the Muggle world. Sirius had swooped in barely 4 weeks after Harry returned to the Dursleys, whisking him away to freedom. When Harry thought about it all, it seemed unlikely he'd ever see that eccentric Mrs. Fig again. A sneeze of wind rattled the canvas overhead, and Mr. Weasley mopped his brow with a handkerchief. He was peering into the strange depth of the tent they'd just entered. On the far side, 4 neatly made bunk beds stood in perfect rows, each mattress piled high with blankets of different colors. "Ah," Mr. Weasley said, stepping back. "This one's borrowed from my colleague Perkins at the Ministry. Poor fellow's been suffering from lumbago for years. Can't go camping himself, so he loaned it to me." No one blinked at the tent's unremarkable facade hiding such a spacious interior. To Harry and Hermione, who was gently tugging Sherlock's sleeve, it all looked perfectly normal, as if they'd seen it a dozen times before. Once the men had explored, Hermione led Sherlock to the next tent. This one was smaller, and the crisp, floral scent of fresh linens replaced any whiff of cat hair they had detected elsewhere. It was obviously meant for the girls. Sirius strolled past them, surveying the arrangement. He caught sight of Ginny, Harry's little sister, standing by the tent's entrance with a questioning look. "Suits her just fine," Sirius said to Mr. Weasley with a grin. "Let Ginny have this one." Mr. Weasley nodded in agreement. "Perfect," he declared, stepping aside so Ginny could slip in and make herself at home. All around the camp, laughter and chatter rose under the starlit sky, and Harry felt a surge of warmth. For the first time in his life, he was truly among family and friends who adored him unconditionally. "We've got 2 tents," Mr. Weasley announced, peering around the clearing. "Hermione and Ginny can share one, and the rest of us can make do with the other." Sherlock raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's all right, Arthur? We don't mean to impose." Mr. Weasley waved a hand, rubbing his palms together in excitement. "Nonsense. Come on, Arthur, stop being so polite. It's a camping trip. Splitting up a little is no trouble at all." After a moment's thought, he nodded eagerly, and just like that, the plan was settled. Sherlock, Harry, and Sirius would occupy one tent as originally intended. Ginny and Hermione would bunk together in the second, and the remaining Weasley brothers divided among a pair of smaller canvas shelters. The cramped conditions suddenly felt far more comfortable, and genuine smiles spread across everyone's faces. But that cheer wouldn't last long. When the group next inspected the tent reserved by the Ministry of Magic for Sirius alone, a heavy silence fell. It was ill-appointed and coldly official, a far cry from the warm camaraderie of the others. No one spoke. The mood shifted subtly, and a small tension lingered in the air. Ginny, however, was buoyant. Sharing a nicer tent with Hermione was one delight, but being close to Harry was the real treat. She smiled at him across the flap as he helped Sirius settle in beside Sherlock and Sherlock's ever-curious notebooks. With his task done, Piers Pocus cleared his throat. "Well, I'll be off then. Enjoy yourselves." "Oh, Mr. Pocus," Ginny began to reply, but Piers had already stepped away, leaving the campsite to its own lively company. As the flap dropped shut behind him, the friends turned their full attention to settling in for the night, readying themselves for whatever adventures lay ahead. "Pocus, aren't you staying with us tonight?" Mr. Weasley called after the young ministry official. Harry glanced up in mild surprise. He'd always thought well of Piers Pocus. Pocus forced a tight smile. I'm afraid not, sir. The ministry's piled more work on me, and I really must get back. Mr. Weasley waved a hand. Oh, come now, Arnold. Stay just a bit longer. Arnold Polkus shook his head. I'm sorry. They'll expect me back. He shrugged and then offered Harry and Sherlock a wry grin. Actually, escorting you two was a welcome break. I haven't had a rest like this in weeks. With a quick nod, Polkus apparated away. The faint crackle of magic vanished, and whatever awkwardness his departure had caused faded almost immediately. Mr. Weasley, never one to dwell on discomfort, picked up the dusty kettle that sat on the ground and peered inside. We'll need water for this. There's a tap marked on the map the Muggle gave us, Ron said, unfolding the crinkled paper. He pointed to a little blue faucet symbol near the edge. Harry, care to fetch us some water? Sure thing. Harry took the kettle. And here are 2 stew pots, Mr. Weasley added, handing them over to Harry and Ron in turn. Then he turned to the rest of the group. All right, everyone else, off you go to gather firewood. We'll want a good fire going before it gets dark. Sherlock, could you lead us, please? But we have a stove, Ron protested. Why can't we just— Ron, remember the Muggle safety regulations, Mr. Weasley interrupted, voice firm. I told you, no magic of any kind from now on. But this tent's magical. That's Perkins's, not ours. It's old magic. It doesn't count. Though his tone was stern, Mr. Weasley's bright eyes and eager smile gave him away. When real Muggles camp, they build their fires outside. I've seen it, so that's how we'll do it. Everyone fell silent, understanding that Mr. Weasley was simply enchanted by this new, strictly Muggle approach. Harry and Ron hefted the kettle and stew pots. Harry said nothing. Filling kettles had been his routine at the Dursleys, after all. Ron scowled. So it's just the 2 of us fetching water? I'll come too, Ginny announced, springing up to snatch the kettle from Harry's hands. Ginny. But she was already striding off. Moments later, the 3 of them were winding through the campsite, heads bent over Mr. Weasley's enchanted map as they followed its directions to the nearest water source. Back in the clearing, the rest of the group busied themselves gathering dry wood, determined to build a proper, Muggle-style campfire. At Weasley's suggestion, everyone set off to gather firewood for the cooking fire. Twigs snapped underfoot as each of them scoured the underbrush, piling branches and fallen logs beside the chosen clearing. Sherlock, meanwhile, approached the task with an almost scientific method. He sorted the wood by size, arranged the kindling in a neat teepee, and left the larger logs poised perfectly for later. When someone raised an eyebrow at his precision, Sherlock simply grinned. It's just common sense, my friend, he said, smoothing back a stray lock of hair. He stepped aside, folding his arms, as the others watched him with renewed respect, and perhaps a touch of envy at how effortlessly he applied logic to such a basic chore. Chapter 465, Seizing Every Opportunity to Be Alone with Sherlock. No matter how tangled the situation, everything seemed to fall into place the moment Sherlock Holmes stepped forward. Under his clear instructions, we split into 3 teams, one to gather dry grass and leaves, another to collect bark and slender twigs, and the third to haul back sturdier pieces of hardwood. Sherlock then asked Sirius and Mr. Weasley to round up a pile of stones for a makeshift hearth. Even the youngest witches and wizards, Hermione and the Weasley twins, worked with surprising efficiency alongside the 2 adults, Sirius Black and Arthur Weasley. Before long, we had amassed all the tinder, kindling, and fuel we'd need. When we regrouped at the campsite, Sherlock was already eyeing a spot for the fire. Arthur Weasley, ever curious, spoke up immediately. Why here? Wouldn't it be more convenient to build closer to the tent? Hermione flashed Sherlock a quick, knowing smile before answering. When you light a fire, you want to be well clear of anything flammable. A stray spark could turn that thicket into an inferno. Sherlock inclined his head in agreement. Scanning the clearing, he noted the wind's direction, checked the overhanging branches, and made certain there was a steady supply of water nearby. Satisfied, he knelt, arranged the stones into a perfect circle, and began organizing our pile of dry grass and kindling. As each of us added a piece of wood, the tension of the day eased, replaced by the comforting rhythm of preparation and the promise of warmth to come. And for a moment, standing shoulder to shoulder with Sherlock, it felt as though nothing could go wrong. That's just common sense, Hermione remarked. Sherlock stood and swept his arm around the clearing. Precisely. Our fire pit needs to be at least 10 feet from tents, dry grass, and shrubbery. In a forest like this, we must also clear away any leaves and branches within 3 feet of the pit to serve as a firebreak. Next, choose firm, level ground, soil or rock, and avoid areas with thick humus. Luckily, this spot is ideal. All we need is a ring of stones, about 3 feet in diameter, to contain the flames. Fred, that rock won't do. It's damp and liable to crack if it heats up. Fred grinned and tossed the stone aside. No problem, but you've got the twins mixed up. That's George, not me. Sherlock regarded him coolly. Actually, you're Fred. George is still way over there, playing in the sand. Mr. Weasley turned from his work and called out, George, hurry it up. We're ready to light the fire. With everyone in position, they began arranging stones and gathering tinder, confident their campfire would be both safe and efficient. One of Mr. Weasley's younger sons turned back to Sherlock, wide-eyed, and jabbed a finger at the 3 piles of wood Sherlock had arranged on the ground. Sherlock, why do stones explode when you heat them? Didn't we bring matches? Why not just use those to light the fire? And why did you have us sort the wood into 3 different piles? He rubbed his hands together like a restless schoolboy. Please, Dad, tell us. At that moment, Fred and George reappeared, exchanging exasperated looks and dropping their foreheads into their hands. Their father's obsession with all things Muggle was, even by Weasley standards, a little too enthusiastic. Sherlock, however, merely smiled and addressed Mr. Weasley. My dear Mr. Weasley, he began, you specifically asked us to follow Muggle safety regulations and not to use magic. Mr. Weasley waved a hand impatiently. Yes, I remember. But what does that have to do with my questions? Sherlock picked up a slender twig from the smallest pile. Because matches alone only give you a momentary spark. You need tinder to catch that spark, kindling to build up a steady flame, and then larger logs to keep it going. Without the right materials in the right order, a match will barely last long enough to singe your fingers. He then tapped a smooth river stone with his wand. As for heated stones, most contain hidden pockets of moisture. When that water suddenly turns to steam, it expands so quickly the rock cracks or even explodes, sending shrapnel in every direction. That's why we never build our hearth directly on loose stones. The boys' eyes gleamed. Fred and George unclenched their fists, and Mr. Weasley, finally satisfied, nodded so vigorously his spectacles almost slipped off. Invention of the matchstick has made the ancient art of fire starting almost obsolete. Gone are the days of rubbing sticks together. Today, we rely on a simple 3-stage process that moves from easy to difficult fuel. First comes the tinder, ultra-dry material that ignites at the slightest spark. Its only requirements are dryness and flammability. Sherlock drew everyone's attention to the small pile of supplies they'd assembled. If you can find birch bark, use it, he said, tapping the curled strips. It's naturally oily, lights instantly, and burns long enough to catch your kindling. Failing that, pine needles, wood shavings, or even dry moss will do. Just steer clear of anything damp. Wet leaves after rain are useless. With good tinder and a match, lighting that first flame is almost effortless. He spoke with total confidence, until Mr. Weasley, ever eager to learn, insisted on giving it a try himself. Sherlock handed him a match, and with a practiced flick, Mr. Weasley struck it, only to watch the tiny flame wink out almost immediately. Around them, Sirius and the rest of the pureblood Weasleys exchanged amused glances, while Sherlock and Hermione, both Muggle-borns well-versed in match etiquette, looked on in sympathetic embarrassment. It wasn't for lack of effort. Mr. Weasley simply hadn't yet learned that tinder is as much about choosing the right material as it is about striking the match. He tried again and again. Spent matches lay scattered at his feet, each one a failed attempt. Yet there was no frustration in his movements, only a steady calm. Finally, with a faint spark, one match head flared to life. He yelped, "Ouch!" and instinctively tossed it aside. Sherlock barely blinked until the little stick of flame landed right in his carefully prepared tinder pile. Sherlock's choice of finely shaved bark and dried grasses was perfect. The tinder caught instantly, and a bright orange glow spread across the shavings. "Well done," Sherlock murmured as the flames licked upward. Mr. Weasley's face broke into a grin. He turned to Sirius, who had watched the whole endeavor with mild amusement. Throwing his arms around him, Weasley crowed, "Did you see that, Sirius? I did it! I lit a fire!" Sherlock, meanwhile, picked up a second bundle of fuel and began feeding it into the blaze. "These thin sticks, under an inch in diameter, are transitional kindling," he explained, snapping one over his knee. It broke with a sharp crack and dropped into the flames. Their job is to catch the spark from the tinder and build the fire's strength before you lay on larger logs. Always choose dry branches that snap crisply. Pine is ideal because its resin burns hot and bright, giving you a strong, steady flame. Sherlock surveyed the timber they'd gathered, his gaze sharp despite the dull afternoon light. "Poplar and willow will do in a pinch," he said, "but avoid fresh, sap-soaked branches, especially fir and eucalyptus. They're heavy with moisture and nearly impossible to ignite. Even if they do burn, they'll smoke you out." At Sherlock's warning, Mr. Weasley hurried forward, releasing Sirius and kneeling beside the embers. Together with Sherlock, he carefully piled the thinner sticks and twigs, stacking them just so until the flames caught hold and began to flicker. Once the little blaze was stable, Sherlock turned to the final pile of wood. He bent over, lifted a hefty branch, and held it up for everyone to see. "This is the real fuel, the thick logs that keep the fire going. Look for pieces at least 2 inches in diameter. Hardwoods like oak, maple, or beech are best. They burn slowly, give off intense heat, and leave very little ash. If you only have softwood, make sure it's well split so the interior can dry out first. And whatever you do, don't use damp logs. They'll smolder, sputter sparks, and fill the air with smoke." With a practiced hand, he laid the first log across the kindling. The fire's hungry tongues licked the wood instantly, crackling to life as it climbed up through the stack. Sherlock nodded, satisfied. The fire was blazing strong at last. "Of course," Sherlock continued, "you'll want to steer clear of any wood that smells off or is known to be poisonous. Poison ivy and oleander, for instance, release toxic fumes when you burn them." He paused, then offered the group a self-satisfied smile. "And that, my friends, is all there is to it, nothing more than basic common sense." The room fell into stunned silence. Hermione was the first to recover. "Sherlock, if I may ask, you've never actually built a campfire before, have you?" Sherlock shrugged, unfazed. Hermione, you found my blind spot. Just like pitching a tent, I've simply never had the right conditions, or need, to do it." Hermione's eyes narrowed. "I knew it. This isn't common sense at all." "My dear Hermione," Sherlock said with a hint of amusement, "I assure you, I'm not the only one who thinks these are simple precautions." "Oh? Who else?" Hermione leaned forward, and the others in the room perked up. Who, aside from Sherlock Holmes, would regard fire safety as common sense? Before anyone else could speak, Sherlock pulled a slim, well-worn book from his coat pocket. He flipped the cover toward them, revealing its title, The Desperate Man's Survival Handbook. "I bought this little gem before my first year at Hogwarts," he explained, tapping the cover. "It seemed like a suitable investment, just in case I ever found myself stranded without the comforts of Baker Street. I just finished reading Bear Grylls' survival manual, an unconventional choice, perhaps, for someone in the magical world. But the book's guiding principle, better safe than sorry, really spoke to me. Grylls draws on his own experiences to teach readers how to handle every conceivable danger, from fording rushing rivers to warding off mountain trolls. His accounts of single-handed showdowns with long-tailed crocodiles, vampires, and lethifolds were so vivid I couldn't put the book down. I'd bought it purely as extracurricular reading, and it proved more useful than I ever expected." Sirius raised an eyebrow. "So you actually learned all that from a muggle named Bear? If you can't absorb knowledge from books and make it your own, what's the point of reading?" Sherlock replied calmly. His question hung in the air, and for once, no one had a witty comeback. "Brilliant," Fred Weasley declared. "This term we'll be tackling advanced figuration." "Right," George added with a grin. "At this rate, we'll master it in no time." Hermione merely shook her head, half amused by the twins' relentless confidence and half relieved the conversation had drifted away from crocodiles. Hermione flipped through the battered pages of Survival Handbook for Desperate Situations and couldn't help but marvel at Bear Grylls' appetite, or lack of squeamishness. He'd eat almost anything to stay alive. "Just chop off the head and it's edible," he'd proclaim. "It's got twice the protein of beef, can't wait to dig in." The thought made her shiver. They waited for the campfire to crank up when Mr. Weasley abruptly sat bolt upright. "Oh, I nearly forgot. There's one more thing." Sirius raised an eyebrow. "What is it now, Arthur?" "Sherlock," Mr. Weasley said, turning to the detective. "You still haven't explained why stones sometimes explode when you heat them." Sherlock glanced at Hermione with a faint smirk. "Why don't you take this one, Hermione?" Hermione straightened. "It comes down to thermal expansion and contraction. Most materials swell as they heat up and contract when they cool. A damp stone has water trapped in its pores or cracks. When you apply heat, that water rapidly turns to steam. The pressure builds until pop, the stone tours or even explodes." Mr. Weasley nodded eagerly. "Steam pressure, of course. Thank you, Miss Granger." Hermione allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as the fire crackled to life. The stone itself is completely solid. It does expand when heated, but only very slowly and by an almost imperceptible amount. Because its crystalline structure is so rigid, it can't stretch to accommodate the growing steam pressure inside. Eventually, the pressure exceeds the stone's tensile strength, and the rock either fractures or fractures explosively. Sensing that her first explanation might still sound a bit abstract, Hermione offered a simpler analogy. Think of water trapped in a sealed glass bottle. As you heat it, steam builds up until pop, the bottle shatters. A rock works the same way, except its seal comes from natural pores and a hard matrix, so when it finally gives, the break is sudden. Mr. Weasley's face lit up. "The Muggle world is truly astonishing," he said, nodding eagerly. "Who would have thought such everyday materials could behave like that?" For a split second, Hermione felt like Sherlock Holmes demystifying the universe. She braced herself for more questions about thermal expansion, or perhaps even a crash course in molecular kinetics, but Mr. Weasley moved on, satisfied. By then, whatever they were trying to light had finally caught, and the fire snapped to life. Yet Harry, Ron, and Ginny were nowhere to be seen. Hermione glanced around anxiously. "Where have they got to?" she murmured. George Weasley frowned at the empty glade. "Where are those three? They should have been back by now." Hermione shrugged. "With so many wizards around, they probably ran into someone they know. It's hard not to stop for a chat." Fred grinned. "Well, at least the fire's roaring." He elbowed his brother. "Sherlock guided us through the whole thing. Without him, we'd still be fumbling with the first spark." Mr. Weasley shot the twins a reproachful look. "That's enough. Sherlock, why don't you go see what's keeping them?" Sherlock opened his mouth, but Mr. Weasley hurried on before he could reply. "Don't worry, I've got this. I promise I won't let the fire die down again." He muttered under his breath. "And if it does, well, I'll just relight it." Sherlock watched Mr. Weasley's eyes light up at the crackle of the flames. He knew the man couldn't resist playing with magical fire. Still, he gave a nod. A gathering of international wizards was too rare an opportunity to miss. "All right," he said. "I'll come too." No sooner had he spoken than Hermione sprang to her feet, tugging at her cloak. "Me too," she declared. And with that, Sherlock and Hermione slipped away into the crowd, leaving George, Fred, and a very satisfied Mr. Weasley to keep the fire burning. Sirius, Mr. Weasley, and Fred and George all broke into knowing smiles at the sight. Hermione's cheeks warmed, but recalling Gemma's last words, "Seize every chance to be alone with Sherlock," she squared her shoulders and hurried after him. Mr. Weasley let out a delighted laugh. "Ah, to be young again." "Indeed," Sirius agreed with a grin. "Nothing quite like it." As they watched Hermione pursue Sherlock, Sirius felt a pang of nostalgia. In his and James's day, it had always been the boy doing the chasing. Now, at last, the roles were reversed. Chapter 466. I want to learn foreign languages, too. "Hey, Sherlock, wait up!" Hermione burst out of the tent, but Sherlock was already striding away, clearly intent on leaving without her. She hurried to catch up, her boots kicking up dust as she ran. "I told you I wanted to come with you. Why didn't you wait?" she demanded, slightly out of breath. Sherlock glanced over his shoulder, his expression cool and unyielding. "Because the moment I looked back, you hesitated," he replied. "Your desire to accompany me simply wasn't strong enough." Hermione bristled. How much more determined did she have to sound? Before she could retort, Sherlock raised an arm and pointed down a narrow lane winding between the tents. "Come on, follow me," he said. "We have work to do." Reluctantly, Hermione fell into step beside him. There was no arguing with Sherlock Holmes when he'd made up his mind. As they moved into the open, the early rays of sunrise broke through the last threads of morning mist, unveiling the sprawling camp. Rows upon rows of canvas shelters stretched away in every direction, a small city of tents that seemed to go on forever. Hermione took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. She might still feel underappreciated by her brilliant companion, but there was no turning back now. If she was going to learn foreign languages and aid Sherlock in unraveling whatever mystery awaited, she would prove how determined she truly could be. Sherlock wandered slowly between the rows of canvas tents, his eyes alight with curiosity as he took in the camp's diversity. Wizards and witches from every corner of the globe had gathered here, each nation's colors and crests fluttering in the breeze. Officially, he and Hermione had come in search of familiar faces, but Sherlock knew that hunting for people was only a convenient pretext. Sooner or later, the water-fetching trio would return from the river. In the meantime, Mr. Weasley's delighted fixation on the roaring bonfire guaranteed that someone was keeping the flames alive and crackling. Truth be told, Sherlock wasn't the least bit worried about the fire's safety. Despite Mr. Weasley's well-meaning but hapless tendencies, Sirius Black and Fred and George Weasley were on hand to keep things from going awry. Between the ex-Auror's vigilance and the twins' propensity for mischief, the campfire was in safe and entertaining hands. Hermione, however, didn't share Sherlock's indifference to the larger situation. She walked at his side, matching his pace tentatively, her mind far busier than her feet. Why had she followed him into the chilly evening? She knew the answer, of course. Gemma's parting words had lingered in her thoughts ever since, along with the memory of their impulsive, electric kiss. Now, with a racing heart, Hermione was determined to carve out as much alone time with Sherlock as she could. If she didn't find a way to deepen their connection before Gemma returned, she feared she'd lose her chance forever. Together, Sherlock and Hermione left two parallel trails of footprints in the dew-damp grass. The bonfire's glow flickered behind them, casting dancing shadows over the camp, a warm, flickering witness to the small, stirring drama unfolding between the brilliant detective and the brightest witch of their age. Hermione stood quietly, taking in the bustling camp spread out before her. A contented smile played at her lips. After all, love, like friendship, was something that deepened over time. "What's got you grinning?" Sherlock asked, spotting the unusual expression on her face. She turned to him, her eyes bright. "Oh, nothing, just a happy memory." Sherlock raised an eyebrow, but didn't press her further. Instead, he let his gaze wander over the hundreds of tents and the throngs of witches and wizards milling about. "I didn't realize there'd be so many people here." Hermione nodded. Yes, so many. She'd known the numbers in theory, around 3,000 wizards in all of Britain, fewer than 300,000 worldwide. But standing here, watching what must be nearly 100,000 magical folk gathered for the Quidditch World Cup, the scale of it struck her. No wonder the Ministry of Magic had its hands full maintaining order. Morning light filtered through the trees as the camp slowly came to life. Those who'd arrived the night before began to emerge from their tents. First, the families with young children, bleary-eyed but eager to greet the day's excitement. Hermione let out a soft laugh. "Looks like it's going to be quite the morning." Sherlock offered her a small smile in return. "Indeed." Hermione suddenly pointed. "Sherlock, look over there." Through the camp's tidy rows of tents, they saw a little boy, no more than 2, squatting outside a tall, pyramid-shaped canvas. In his chubby hand was a wand, which he was waving at a small slug on the grass. With each flick, the slug slowly ballooned until it was as thick as a sausage. By the time they drew nearer, the boy's mother burst from the tent, alarm on her face. "Kevin, how many times have I told you not to touch your father's wand? Ow!" She never got to finish. Mid-step, she planted her foot right on the swollen slug. There was a sickly pop, and a splatter of slime echoed in the sudden hush. Even as Sherlock and Hermione continued on, they could still hear the mother's exasperated cries mingling with Kevin's wails. "You squashed it! You squashed the worm!" Sherlock and Hermione exchanged amused glances. Hermione smiled. "I've never seen a wizard that young before. Have you, Sherlock?" Sherlock allowed himself a small grin. "Actually, I have. Hermione flushed with surprise. You have? When? I saw it in a photograph at Grimmauld Place, Sherlock said, pausing on the path. Hermione turned to him. What was it? Sherlock cleared his throat. It was one of Lily's letters to Sirius. In it, she mentions that Harry, at barely a year old, could already toddle atop a miniature broomstick Sirius had sent him as a gift. Hermione laughed, the sound bright in the morning air. No wonder he became the youngest seeker in a century. His skill must have shown up almost immediately. Indeed, Sherlock replied with a small smile. Not bad for a baby. Hermione followed his gaze and spotted two tiny figures weaving above the grass. A pair of little witches, no more than 2 years old, about Kevin's age, balanced expertly on miniature broomsticks. Their feet skimmed the dew-soaked lawn, and their giggles wove together like fairy bells. She couldn't help but grin. Magic is astonishing. Even now, I can barely believe the day I received my Hogwarts letter. Hermione turned to Sherlock, her eyes shining with a strange mix of wonder and relief. If I'd never received that owl-delivered letter, we might never have met, she said softly. Sherlock regarded her with his usual calm intensity. That isn't necessarily true. Hermione's brow lifted in surprise. You mean, even if I'd never become a witch, fate could still have brought us together? Her mind raced through dozens of romantic possibilities, a chance meeting in a cafe, a collision on a rain-slicked street, until Sherlock cut through them all with that trademark deadpan. With your intellect, he said seriously, if you'd chosen a life of crime, Scotland Yard wouldn't stand a chance of catching you. They'd have to call me in, and that would be how we met. Hermione could only gape. Of all the scenarios she'd imagined, she longed to disappear into a quiet corner and wallop her head against a stone pillar until she forgot what she'd said. Just then, an adult wizard bustled past, scowling down his nose. What on earth are you two doing cavorting about in broad daylight? He demanded. Hermione and Sherlock exchanged awkward glances, each silently counting the ways this day had not gone as planned. Their parents are probably still asleep. Hermione sighed and seized the moment to change the subject. Is that a Ministry of Magic employee over there? Apparently, Sherlock replied, barely glancing up. They strolled along the dusty path through the campsite, taking Etsep G in the morning bustle. Small clusters of adult wizards were emerging from their tents, preparing breakfast. The pair couldn't help but smile at the sight. Some wizards darted wary glances around before discreetly igniting tiny fires with their wands. Others, Mr. Weasley among them, struck matches with skeptical expressions, as though they expected nothing to happen. A bit further on, 3 African wizards in flowing white robes sat deep in discussion, grilling what looked like a wild rabbit over a bed of purple, glowing embers. Nearby, a circle of middle-aged witches chattered and laughed beneath a shimmering banner stretched between 2 tents. Salem Witches Association. Hermione tapped Sherlock's arm. Sherlock, can you understand what they're saying? Sherlock paused, brow furrowed, his eyes fixed on the distant group of witches. He listened intently, every muscle still. Hermione pulled back, startled to see him so absorbed, and for the first time that morning, a hint of surprise flickered across his face. Hermione strained to catch the conversation drifting through the corridor, but the words all sounded like gibberish. She only sensed the crowd's excitement. Sherlock, noticing her puzzled expression, offered a calm explanation. They're arguing over who has the better chance this year, Ireland or Bulgaria. Most people favor Ireland, but Bulgaria's seeker is exceptionally skilled. She could turn the match in their favor. Hermione's eyes went wide. You understood all that? My dear Hermione, Sherlock replied with a faint smile, I've told you I almost never lie, unless it's absolutely necessary, and now isn't one of those occasions. Hermione bit her lip. I'm not doubting you, really. I'm just surprised. What language are they speaking? Latin, he said, though it's laced with dialects and slang, so I can't catch every nuance. Wait, Latin? Hermione stared. You speak Latin? Sherlock raised an eyebrow. You look surprised. Of course I'm surprised. You never mentioned it. You never asked, he pointed out. Hermione paused, then squared her shoulders. All right, then. How many foreign languages do you actually speak? French, German, and Latin, said Sherlock. Hermione did a quick mental calculation. So including English, that makes 4, and you're only 14. She shook her head in wonder. Remarkable. Hermione had always known Sherlock was brilliant, but even she wasn't prepared for this new revelation. She stared at him, wide-eyed, as he casually mentioned yet another hidden talent. "You needn't be so surprised, Hermione," he said with a faint, knowing smile. "Mastering languages is simply another tool in my detective arsenal." Hermione's eyes lit up. "Foreign languages, I want to learn them with you, Sherlock. Just one more, at least," she said, her voice bright with hope. She was about to ask which language he had in mind when a strange green glow filled her vision. For a heartbeat, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, then realized they'd actually stumbled into a sea of living emerald. Every tent in the camp lay buried beneath thick mats of shamrocks, the foliage rising in rolling hill-like mounds that stretched to the horizon. Hermione's eyes went wide. What's happening here?" Sherlock paused for a heartbeat, then chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Muggle-repelling enchantments, by the look of it. Quite ingenious." Hermione followed his gaze to the surrounding tents, each one festooned with glowing runes, twinkling glyphs, and charms that faintly hummed in the summer air. Among ordinary campers, even the most devoted environmentalists wouldn't dare decorate so conspicuously. They'd draw every prying eye in the county. Only wizards, stubborn, self-absorbed ones who ignore all warnings, would risk attracting that much attention. As Sherlock's mind began profiling the tent's owner, Vane, delighting in the spotlight, a familiar voice rang out behind them. "Hey, Sherlock! Hermione!" Without turning, Sherlock already knew who it was. His Hogwarts room. 8, the dark-skinned boy who never stopped singing, dancing, rapping about Quidditch, or shooting hoops whenever he got the chance. Dean Thomas. And while Dean was a welcome face, Sherlock knew he wasn't the mastermind behind this magical canvas display, merely a guest. Sherlock pivoted to see Dean standing beside the true proprietor, a tall wizard in an elaborate emerald cloak, arms folded and wearing a triumphant grin. "Dean," Sherlock said coolly, "I didn't realize you were back in the countryside." Dean shrugged, flashing a quick grin at Hermione. "Just helping out a friend, but you two look like you've seen a ghost." Hermione crossed her arms, eyeing the decorated tent as if it might spring to life. "More like wizards who don't believe in subtlety." Sherlock smiled. "Precisely." Seamus Finnegan, Sherlock's best friend and fellow Gryffindor, affectionately nicknamed the Blaster, was sitting in front of his tent, which was festooned with shamrocks from top to bottom. A woman with light blonde hair stood at his side. Sherlock took one look and smiled. Of course, this was Mrs. Finnegan. "This is my mum," Seamus announced, ushering Sherlock and Hermione forward. With a mischievous grin, he added, "Like our decorations. The ministry's been grumbling about them all morning." "Ahem. Why shouldn't we show our colors?" Seamus challenged good-naturedly. Mrs. Finnegan rolled her eyes at her son's teasing, but greeted them warmly. "Honestly, they ought to see the Bulgarian camp. Those tents are drab navy, and they're always peeking over here. So you two must be cheering for Ireland, right?" Sherlock exchanged a quick glance with Hermione and realized the point of all the shamrocks. They were flying green in support of the Irish team. Mrs. Finnegan's eyes sparkled as she waited for their answer, and Hermione felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She managed a shy nod. "Yes! Go Ireland!" The charged silence in the stands made Hermione hesitate. She had no idea how to refuse Mrs. Finnegan's request. Before she could reply, Sherlock stepped forward and delivered a masterclass in polite refusal. "I'm afraid I can't take sides, Mrs. Finnegan." He met Seamus's mother's astonished stare and spoke with unruffled precision. "First, I came here purely because I'm fascinated by world-class Quidditch, without any prior commitments. Second, I genuinely don't believe your protest will help the team you're defending. Third, the Ministry of Magic is only stepping in because your actions are disrupting their work, so it's understandable they've intervened. And finally, just because the Bulgarian fans have hidden their tents doesn't mean you should stoop to their level." Mrs. Finnegan gaped at him, utterly floored by the logic and calm certainty of his words. She tried to speak, "Why you? How dare you?" but couldn't form a coherent sentence, her finger shaking as she pointed accusingly at Sherlock. Sensing the tension was growing unbearable, Seamus and Dean each took hold of one of Sherlock's arms and gently steered him away. Hermione murmured a quick apology to Mrs. Finnegan, offered a polite nod, and hurried after her friends into the crowd. When she stepped outside, she was surprised to find Seamus and Dean taking turns showering Sherlock with praise, their eyes practically glowing with admiration. Chapter 467. Judging a book by its cover is wrong. Hermione hurried outside just in time to see Dean and Seamus, having finally released Sherlock from their enthusiastic grip, showering him with praise. "Sherlock, that was brilliant. As expected of the Lion King, you didn't let us down." Dean slapped Sherlock on the back. "Who says that just because we're British we have to root for the Irish team?" Sherlock grinned. "Personally, I'd rather cheer for Bulgaria." Seamus laughed. "Me too. Gotta support Crumb." Dean glanced nervously toward the decorated tent. "But I'd never admit that in front of Mum." "You nailed it, Sherlock," Seamus agreed. "Ireland's got plenty of fans. They don't need us." Hermione couldn't help but smile at their banter. She'd never have expected Dean and Seamus to drag Sherlock outside over a Quidditch debate, let alone praise him for daring to contradict Seamus's mother in front of a room full of Ireland supporters. She found herself admiring Sherlock's bold honesty. She would never have had the courage to speak so frankly in that atmosphere. "Blind loyalty is empty," Sherlock declared, folding his arms. "And decking out a tent just for show? That's mere formalism." Hermione watched him, struck by the truth of his words. In a world that often prized appearances above all else, Sherlock's insistence on genuine conviction was a lesson she would not soon forget. Sherlock tapped his chin thoughtfully. "If it really is just personal preference, there's no harm in it. But since we need to avoid attracting Muggles' attention, we can't afford any public displays like that. It's a shame the Ministry seems powerless on this front. At this rate, we'll have to resort to a memory charm." Dean and Seamus exchanged a proud glance at Sherlock's praise, but he quickly shifted topics. "You two must have run into Harry and the others earlier, right?" Seamus beamed. "Exactly, Sherlock. I just knew you'd figure it out." He nudged Dean conspiratorially. "My mum even strong-armed them into admitting they're backing the Ireland team. They weren't half as bold as you. You'd have blown it wide open. Just you wait until we get home. My mum is going to be livid." He grinned at the thought, clearly relishing his role as the dutiful son confronting his mum's ire. Dean chimed in. Ginny overheard Seamus's mum grumbling about some odd decorations on the Bulgarian tents. Naturally, she was curious, so she and Seamus went off to see for themselves. Sherlock gave a slight nod and pointed. "That way." Dean raised an eyebrow. "Honestly, Sherlock, how do you know everything?" "It's just observation," Sherlock replied, his tone perfectly calm. Since they already knew where Seamus and Ginny would have gone for water, Sherlock and Hermione skipped the watering hole entirely. Instead, they followed the faint trail through the mist toward the Bulgarian encampment, eager to discover what had so displeased Seamus's mum. The camp appeared through the gray haze like a beacon, flags of white, green, and red snapping crisply in the breeze. Unlike Seamus's mum, who'd wrapped her tent in vines and flowers, the Bulgarians had kept their shelters plain. Yet one unmistakable feature made every tent impossible to ignore. Painted boldly on each canvas was the same portrait, identical in every detail, its gaze fixed unerringly on anyone who passed. Hermione paused in front of one of the tent flaps, peering at the enchanted portrait pinned to the canvas wall. Most magical portraits bubbled with energy, figures waving, shifting positions, even conversing if you listened long enough. But this young man's image was almost hypnotically still. He had thick eyebrows, large dark eyes, and a strong, chiseled face set in an expression so cool it verged on indifferent. The portrait cycled endlessly between just two poses, a brief, worried frown, and a measured half-blink so subtle you could almost miss it. "Who is this?" Hermione asked, brow furrowed. The repetition was disarming. Like the painter had only known him in a match-day frame of meing, Nen and nothing more. Sherlock glanced over without missing a beat. "Crumb, the Bulgarian seeker." Hermione's eyes widened. Sherlock Holmes talking about Quidditch? She'd never heard him mention a single player before. "How do you know him?" He gave a half-smile and returned his gaze to the portrait, as if it might reveal more under scrutiny. His fingertips drummed a silent pattern against his palm. "Seamus Finnegan said he'd rather see Ireland win the cup, but the moment Bulgaria took the field, he switched allegiances. 'They've got Crumb,' he said. Simple as that. Hermione shrugged, still studying the frozen image of Victor Krum. Even in stillness, there was something magnetic about the young seeker, something both hard and compelling that drew the eye back again and again. And judging by Siamus's comment, it wasn't just the portrait that held the crowd's attention. "Did you catch what those Latin-speaking wizards were saying back there?" Sherlock asked as they strolled past the row of Bulgarian tents. "Word is, Bulgaria's seeker has a knack for changing the outcome of a match all on his own. Even if his team is trailing, he somehow manages to snatch victory. No surprise they've plastered his likeness everywhere." Hermione glanced at the countless posters of Victor Krum lining the tents. Each one showed him with that familiar scowl, brow furrowed, lips pressed tight. She shivered. "I don't like him," she said flatly. "He looks so gloomy. It's unsettling." Sherlock paused and turned to face her. "Now, Hermione, you know better than to judge a book by its cover." He gave a small, knowing smile. "Between Seamus's praise and the Bulgarian's admiration, it's pretty clear this Krum fellow is an exceptional Quidditch player. I've told you before, appearances can be deceiving." Hermione's lips twitched in an amused half-smile. "Oh, yes, because you never judge a book by its cover," she murmured, her gaze softening as it drifted back to Sherlock's calm profile. Hermione paused, a memory surfacing from weeks earlier. She had once teased Sherlock about his type, whether he preferred Gemma's refined elegance or the Patil twins' warm friendliness. He had answered with characteristic precision. Appearance was the most superficial of qualities, irrelevant to any real judgment. Now, watching him speak calmly with Victor Krum, even as the Bulgarian champion's moodiness weighed on the tent walls, she saw his point. Sherlock had neither flinched nor faltered. He treated Krum as he would any other person, evaluating him on merit, not on a frown or a scowl. Finally, they stepped beyond the Bulgarian camp's perimeter, leaving behind the sea of stern Krum posters. Hermione exhaled in relief and pressed her fingertips to her temples. After navigating that gauntlet of gloomy glares, her chest felt less tight, her breathing more even. Just then, a familiar voice floated from nearby. Rounding the corner, they found Harry, Ron, and Ginny filling their canteens at a water trough. Hermione's earlier deduction about where her friends had gone had been spot on. Harry and the others really had run into acquaintances, Cho Chang and her parents. Hermione couldn't help the knowing smile that tugged at her lips. With Harry catching up to Cho, it was no wonder they'd been held up. Cho was as radiant as ever, and compared to their last meeting at Grimmauld Place, she seemed even more at ease, chatting and laughing alongside Harry with genuine delight. Meanwhile, Ron stood deep in conversation with Zhang Wei, their animated expressions suggesting a thoroughly pleasant exchange. Ginny, on the other hand, was speaking with Jujidali, though her smile carried a trace of awkwardness. All at once, Ginny's eyes lit up as she spotted Sherlock and Hermione approaching. "Sherlock, Hermione, over here!" she called, waving enthusiastically. The pair hurried forward, and with warm smiles they greeted their friends. "Uncle Zhang, Auntie Zhu." Zhang Wei looked up in genuine curiosity. "How did you two manage to get out here?" Jujidali laughed softly and gave our daughter a gentle nudge. "We came to find Harry and the others, of course." Cho Chang's cheeks flushed pink. She'd been so caught up in chatting with Harry that she'd completely forgotten their chores. Hastily, she greeted Sherlock and Hermione, then slipped back beside her parents. Harry shifted uncomfortably. Ever since arriving this year, he realized how easily distracted he'd become, especially around attractive classmates. Jujidali turned to Cho with a soft smile. "All right, Cho, enough talking. Come help your friends stoke the fire and start dinner." Cho bit her lip, nodded, and hurried off. Zhang Wei scratched his head. "But isn't there a spell, aguamenti, right? That conjures water instantly? Why go through all this fuss?" "Aguamenti, yes," Jujidali replied, amusement in her eyes. "Yet everyone chose to draw water the old-fashioned way. It proves they're law-abiding, or so they claim. Who'd risk a rule-breaking infraction over a few buckets of water?" Zhang Wei shrugged, unconvinced. "It doesn't make sense to me. I've seen wizards light campfires with a flick of their wands. I'd much rather use magic than haul water around all day." Jujidali only smiled enigmatically. "Perhaps there's more to tradition than convenience, or maybe some mysteries are best left unexplained." Letting them light fires and cook Muggle style is a disaster. Jiang Wei grumbled as he surveyed the smoldering tents around them. Several of them have already burned down. I don't know what the organizers were thinking. All right, Wei, enough, Jugadali said, placing a gentle hand on her husband's arm. Jiang Wei's irritation vanished the moment he saw her warm smile. You old goof, he teased. After all these years, you're still as beautiful as ever. Dolly laughed softly. Not nearly long enough. A lifetime by your side still wouldn't be enough. At this, the younger wizards exchanged quick, embarrassed glances. There were children nearby, after all. Cho Chang's cheeks turned bright red. She wished she could tunnel her family's 2-bedroom cottage straight into the earth. She stole a glance at Harry, whose expression was one of the purest envy. Cho ducked her head, too mortified to speak. Once they'd wrapped up their polite farewells to Cho Chang and her parents, the group set off again. Ginny strode ahead, beaming, though only she knew why. With Sherlock and Hermione helping carry the freshly drawn water, their pace quickened considerably. Still, it wasn't long before they slowed again. Familiar faces kept popping up along the trail, or rather, familiar faces kept spotting them. The gathering was mostly Hogwarts students and their families, but the real attention always fell on 2 figures, Sherlock Holmes and Harry Potter. Sherlock, hailed as the wise Lion King, and Harry, celebrated as the savior of the magical world, drew admiring glances wherever they went. People practically stopped in mid-stride just to offer a greeting. Not far behind them in popularity were Hermione Granger and Ginny Weasley. Hermione, top of her class 3 years running, had aced every exam and earned the nickname Miss Know-It-All, her reputation second only to Sherlock's and Harry's. Ginny, now in her 3rd year, was turning heads for a different reason. She had come into her own and was blossoming into a true beauty. As Dean, Sherlock's roommate, liked to point out, many British lads found Cho Chang's quiet, reserved charm hard to appreciate, but Ginny's bright, outgoing allure captivated every native boy she passed. Wherever she went, a small crowd of admirers trailed in her wake. Poor Ron Weasley, by contrast, had seen his brief fame as the Gryffindor chess master fizzle out shortly after first year, and the nickname was rarely heard again once he reached his 2nd. To make matters worse, he was still the tallest of the bunch, impossible to miss, but seldom met with the same kind of admiration. He looked every bit the hired muscle, or more accurately a thug, next to the other 4, and he naturally went unnoticed. Ron, however, was a bit slow on the uptake and still hadn't realized it. Most of the people they passed merely offered a friendly wave, but a few would pull them aside for a longer chat. Take Oliver Wood, whom they'd just run into. Wood was no ordinary bloke. He was tall, powerfully built, and undeniably handsome. A recent Hogwarts graduate, he'd spent his final year as captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team and had led them to lift the Quidditch Cup for the first time in years. His obsession with Quidditch was legendary. In the twins' words, not even a rain of hexes from the sky could keep him off his broom. While that was a bit of an exaggeration, it perfectly captured his single-minded devotion. After all, throughout his 7 years at Hogwarts, every class he took seemed like little more than a sideshow to the real event, the match. Such fervor could only have been fostered by a family that understood and encouraged his passion. Whenever there was a big match like this, the entire Wood family would flock to the pitch to watch, and today was no exception. The instant Mr. Wood caught sight of Harry and Sherlock, he practically swept them off their feet, pulled them into his parents' tent, and began enthusiastically introducing them to every adult in sight. Hermione, Ron, and Ginny trailed behind, exchanging amused glances. None of them were surprised. Mr. Wood's boundless energy was well known, so after a shared shrug, they followed the duo inside. As soon as the door flap fell shut, Mr. Wood launched into a glowing eulogy of Harry's 3 years at Hogwarts. He spoke of Harry's astonishing record as Seeker, credited him single-handedly for Gryffindor's triumphs in the Quidditch Cup, and rattled off accolades. Youngest Seeker in a century, born for the sport, even outshining Charlie Weasley. With barely a breath between them. The older Woods beamed with pride, nodding and murmuring their agreement. When he finally paused, Mr. Wood turned his full attention to Sherlock. Though Sherlock had never suited up for Gryffindor's house team, Mr. Wood insisted he'd long recognized the boy's raw talent on a broom. Seizing the moment, he raised the subject, yet again, of Sherlock's potential tryout. "Next year," he said earnestly, "we'd love to have you on the team. What do you say?" The tent fell silent, all eyes fixed on Sherlock as the Wood family awaited his reply. Now that Gryffindor was short on players, Sherlock, ever the Lion King of the house, knew he couldn't sit on the sidelines. He had a duty to step up and put his skills to good use. Whenever Quidditch came up in conversation, Wood seemed to transform into a different person, wildly enthusiastic, almost. Sherlock was accustomed to it by now and hardly batted an eye. Harry, however, felt a flush of embarrassment. Wood's praise was so over the top it made him uncomfortable. According to Wood, Gryffindor's win of last term's Quidditch Cup rested entirely on Harry's shoulders. Harry knew better. No one could win a match alone. Chapter 468. Only Harry's substitute Quidditch, much like football in the Muggle world, has always been a team sport. No matter how talented one player might be, victory can't rest on a single pair of shoulders. Harry had grasped that truth the first time he watched a match. So when Oliver Wood insisted that Gryffindor's success was all down to Harry alone, Harry couldn't help flushing with embarrassment. "Oliver, it isn't just me," Harry protested. "We win or lose because of every player on the pitch." Wood waved off the protest with a hearty chuckle. "Nonsense. From the moment you joined the team in your first year, I knew we'd lift the cup. If it hadn't been for all those, incidents, we'd have been champions 3 years running by now." Harry's cheeks burned hotter at the reminder. He'd been at the center of plenty of accidents in his first 2 years at Hogwarts, and those memories were anything but triumphant. Seeing Harry's discomfort, Oliver quickly changed the subject. "Now, here's some real good news. I've signed my first professional contract." Harry and Sherlock, who was lounging nearby reading a Muggle newspaper, both looked up in surprise. "That's right," Oliver said, beaming. "I'm officially under contract with Puddlemere United." Puddlemere United, founded way back in 1163, was one of the oldest and most prestigious clubs in the British and Irish Quidditch League. Their roster was packed with star chasers and seasoned beaters, and breaking into that lineup was no small feat. "How did it happen?" Sherlock asked, folding the newspaper with an arched eyebrow. "Well," Oliver said, "I'd made a few impressions observing their trials last month. They liked my beating style, said I had the right balance of aggression and control, so they offered me a spot on their bench as a substitute." Harry grinned. "That's brilliant, Oliver. You've worked for this for years." Sherlock leaned forward, interest clearly piqued. "And will you actually get to play, or is it purely a backup position?" "Depends on injuries, form, and the captain's mood," Wood admitted with a laugh. "But even if I only get a handful of minutes each game, I'll be out there in a professional stadium, wearing Puddlemere blue. That's more than I ever dared hope for." Harry clapped him on the shoulder. "I'll be cheering every time you take the pitch." "Thank you," Oliver said, his grin broadening. He turned back to his teammates. "All we need now is a bit of good luck. No dark curses, no rogue Death Eaters, and certainly no escaped basilisks. Just pure, honest Quidditch." Harry and Sherlock exchanged amused looks. In Harry's life, pure, honest Quidditch was almost a joke, but hearing Oliver's enthusiasm, he dared to hope that maybe this year things could really go smoothly. And for once, it was nice to imagine a world where Quidditch, and nothing more perilous, was the greatest challenge they'd face. Puddlemere United holds the distinction of being the oldest continuously operating team in the Quidditch League, tracing its roots back to medieval England. By the close of the 20th century, Puddlemere had claimed the Quidditch League Cup 22 times and captured the European Cup twice, first in 1290 and again in 1379. That Wood managed to sign with such a storied club straight out of school, even if only as a reserve, spoke volumes about his talent. After a few minutes of eager chattering, Wood finally released his grip on Sherlock and Harry, his eyes still shining with excitement. Before he could start on another story, Ginny seized her chance. "I've decided to try out for the Gryffindor Quidditch team this year," she announced, her voice steady but her cheeks pink. "That's fantastic." Wood broke into a grin. "So what position are you aiming for?" "I'm betting Angelina's the next captain. She'll listen to any recommendation I give her. If you want to be keeper, I can teach you loads of techniques, like spotting a beater's feints before they even swing." Ginny shook her head, though her voice trembled with determination. "No, keepers no. Tea for me. I want to be seeker." Wood blinked, genuinely puzzled. "Seeker? But we've already got the best seeker in all of Hogwarts." He really was like a block of wood sometimes, totally clueless about what goes on in a girl's mind. Yet Ginny's eyes gleamed with resolve, and Wood, for once, could only shrug. Whatever her reasons, Ginny was set on chasing the golden snitch herself. "I'll step in as a substitute," Ginny volunteered, shooting Harry a quick, furtive look before turning away and telling herself, "That makes me his substitute, alone." "Actually, that's a brilliant idea," Oliver Wood said, his eyes lighting up at the mention of Quidditch. "You know, Gryffindor should have had reserves ages ago. 7 starters aren't enough. What if someone gets hurt? There's no one to replace them." He paused, his voice growing softer, tinged with emotion. "Back in Harry's first year, if we'd had a substitute seeker, we wouldn't have had to play a man down. Harry, don't misunderstand me. I'm not blaming you." "As captain, I should have thought of this sooner," Oliver Wood admitted, then fixed Ginny with a sharp gaze. "Your build is perfect for a seeker." He began to pace around her, eyes assessing every angle. "You're light and agile, just what I look for. It's a shame I haven't seen you fly yet, or I could offer more precise pointers. How about taking to the skies now?" Hermione stepped forward, frowning. "I doubt the Ministry would be pleased. Just a moment ago, 2 first-years got caught playing on brooms and were hauled off to see their parents." Wood waved off her concern. "A pity, of course, but don't let it discourage you. Work hard and you'll get your chance." Once Wood had gone on his way, Ron turned to Ginny, curiosity shining in his eyes. "Ginny, when did you decide you wanted to join the Quidditch team?" Ginny's heart leapt. She blinked, forced a casual smile. "Right now. I mean, just then. Seeing Wood made me realize I ought to try." Ron rubbed the bridge of his nose, glancing sideways. "Funny you mention it. I've been thinking of trying out too." His voice dropped to a murmur. He knew his flying couldn't rival Harry's or Malfoy's, but now that they were in 4th year, maybe it was time to give it a go. Ron Weasley's eyes lit up as Harry Potter mentioned the opening on Gryffindor's Quidditch team. "Wood's graduated," Harry said, clapping Ron on the shoulder. "That leaves us 1 keeper short. If you win the trials, you're in as a starter." Ron's casual mention of trying out, even my sister's considering it, had been just a joke at first. But now, with Harry pressing the point, the idea gnawed at him. Couldn't he do as well as Ginny? Surely he wasn't worse than his own sister. Ginny Weasley, standing a few paces away, stiffened. Of course she'd joined Quidditch hoping for more time with Harry. If Ron made the team, he'd be an excuse for Harry to devote hours to strategy and practice, and maybe leave her on the sidelines more than she wanted. She bit her lip. She couldn't let that happen. She had to figure something out. Nearby, Sherlock Holmes watched the exchange with a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He was just about to offer his own, undeniably astute insight into Ron's chances when Hermione Granger caught his arm and pressed a finger to her lips. He arched an eyebrow at her warning gesture. He knew Hermione's silent entreaty all too well. If he spoke now, he would likely turn the whimsical banter into a forensic analysis, and nobody wanted that. A glint of amusement danced in his eyes as he swallowed his response. With that, the moment passed. Ron glanced at Harry, uncertainty and excitement warring on his face. Ginny's expression shifted from calculation to reluctant acceptance. Hermione released Sherlock's arm, and he stepped back, folding his arms, as if the whole scene held no further fascination. And so the question hung in the air. Would Ron try out for keeper, and how would the team and Ginny's delicate plans be changed by his decision? Hermione couldn't help but let out a quiet sigh of relief, until she checked herself. Hadn't her intervention just now proved Gemma's warning right? She'd been defending Sherlock, keeping him from blurting out something that might land him in trouble. No, she told herself firmly. She was looking out for Sherlock, not for Gemma's sake, but for both of their sakes. After parting ways with Wood, they'd barely taken a few steps when another classmate rushed up to them. Ernie Macmillan, a Hufflepuff in their year, was impossible to miss with his broad frame and earnest grin. Ernie had made his reputation back in second year by adamantly insisting that Harry was the heir of Slytherin, that he'd opened the Chamber of Secrets and sent a monster after Muggle-born students. "If you doubt my bloodline," Ernie had declared, "trace it back 9 generations, every one pure blood." It was almost comical how blind he'd been to the danger of his accusations. Yet when all the facts came out and Harry was exonerated, Ernie had been among the first to apologize, sincerely begging Harry's forgiveness, which Harry, true to form, granted without hesitation. Harry needed no second invitation to forgive Ernie Macmillan. 2 years had passed since the Chamber of Secrets, and Harry's kindness was as steady as ever. Yet every time Ernie caught sight of him, the older boy's eyes would widen in remorse. He'd come up, grasp Harry's arm in apology, and even press an invitation on him. "Harry, why don't you stop by our tent? My mum made pumpkin pasties. She swears they're the best in the camp." Harry tucked a hand around the handle of his water bucket and shook his head with a small, apologetic smile. "Thanks, Ernie, but I really must deliver these. Everyone's counting on me." Ernie hesitated, murmured a few more well wishes, then let go. As Ernie strode away, Ron scowled behind him. "He acts like he owes Harry a fortune, more than Percy ever did." Sherlock, walking a pace behind Harry, offered a quiet counterpoint. "Ernie's a straightforward sort. What you saw just now was sincere regret, no grandstanding." They resumed their trek across the camp and soon ran into more familiar faces. Neville Longbottom, clutching a thick textbook, almost dropped it in his startled wave. And not far off, the Patil twins were already debating who would win today's match. With eager grins, they beckoned Harry and his friends over. "Come on," Padma urged. "Tell us who you think will take the cup." Harry sighed. No rest for the weary, but he couldn't help returning their smiles. Between apologies, patrols, and predictions, the day was shaping up to be another busy one. Hannah Abbott practically bounced as she led Sherlock toward her parents' tent. "Mum, Dad, this is my friend Sherlock Holmes," she announced, beaming. Her father, a broad-shouldered man with a kindly face, stepped forward and shook Sherlock's hand. "Thank you again, Mr. Holmes. Without your help clearing my name, I don't know where I'd be." Sherlock offered a modest nod. "I'm just glad everything worked out." Since the incident, Sherlock had quietly withdrawn from the ministry's bustle. In years past, a Quidditch World Cup would have been the kind of grand affair he dove into headfirst. Now, he and Mrs. Holmes and their little daughter were content to watch from the sidelines, greeting old colleagues rather than jumping into official duties. They strolled back toward the Weasleys' camp, pausing every few steps to exchange friendly words with passing witches and wizards. By the time they reached the central tent, George Weasley called out with an amused grin. "About time you two showed up." He gestured to a roaring bonfire where Mr. Weasley was crouched, feeding logs into flames that leapt half a person's height. "If you'd been any later, Dad would have burned through every stick in the woods." Mr. Weasley looked up, unperturbed. "Well then, we'll just go gather more, won't we?" He laughed, and the warm glow of the fire lit their faces as the family reunited under the camping lanterns. Weasley didn't even glance up as he prodded the fire with a stick, his eyes bright with childlike wonder. "The fire's already going. Just keep it burning. How hard can that be?" Since the water was already fetched, no one needed reminding. It was almost time for dinner. Nothing fancy, just boiled eggs and sausages, so everyone set about preparing the meal. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the edge of the woods. 3 red-headed men strode into the clearing. Leading the way was Percy Weasley, recognizable by his horn-rimmed glasses and neatly pressed shirt. A half-step behind him, Bill and Charlie exchanged easy laughter as they walked. Ginny caught the curious glances of Sherlock, Harry, Hermione, and Sirius, then leaned forward to introduce her brothers in a low, proud voice. "These are Bill and Charlie." For a moment, her usual reserve melted away, and in her eyes shone the admiration she'd always felt for her eldest siblings. Sherlock gave Ginny a conspiratorial smile. "You might not realize it, but we've already met them." "Met who?" Ginny blinked. "Did they ever visit Grimmauld Place?" Sirius leaned back in his chair, a far-off look in his eyes. "Not in person," he said softly. "We saw them in a photograph." He paused, as if tasting the memory. "It's an image I'll never forget." Almost a year ago, Mr. Arthur Weasley won the Daily Prophet's grand prize, a remarkable stroke of luck for any ministry employee. With the winnings in hand, the entire Weasley clan decamped to Egypt, where Bill was stationed with Gringotts. The Prophet ran a feature titled Ministry of Magic Employee Wins Big Prize, complete with a photograph of all 9 Weasleys: Molly, Arthur, Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred, George, Ron, and Ginny, beaming in front of the Great Pyramid. Delighted by the sight, Ron clipped the article and sent copies to Harry, Hermione, and Sherlock, eager to share his family's triumph. Sirius recalled the moment as clearly as if it were yesterday. Fudge was returning from an inspection at Azkaban when he picked up that issue of the Prophet. I spotted the same photo at his side, and there, clinging to Ron's shoulder, was Scabbers. The missing toe gave him away immediately. That rat wasn't just any pest, it was Peter Pettigrew. Ginny went still at the revelation, the room growing suddenly quiet. Sherlock watched her carefully, knowing that unraveling this photograph's secret would change everything. Recognizing Peter Pettigrew's disguise had been the spark that drove Sirius Black to break out of Azkaban and set all the later events into motion. Now, a year on, thinking back on that desperate flight felt like recalling another lifetime. Since then, Pettigrew's treachery has been exposed and justice served, and Sirius himself has been fully exonerated, so much so that he's now officially an honored guest of the Ministry of Magic. A genuine smile of relief curved Sirius's lips as he glanced first at Harry and then at Sherlock Holmes, pride shining in his eyes. Harry couldn't have asked for a finer friend than Sherlock. Sherlock, feeling Sirius's approving gaze, shifted his attention to the 2 brothers standing nearby, Bill and Charlie Weasley. A photograph could never capture the same impression as meeting them in person. William, the eldest, stood just under 6 feet tall, currently the tallest of the Weasley clan, though Ron's recent growth spurt might soon change that. Bill's long red hair was gathered into a simple ponytail, and from one ear swung an earring shaped like a tiny folding fan. Charlie lingered a step behind, his calm presence marking him as every bit the steady counterpoint to his exuberant older brother. Bill appeared first, dressed as if he were headlining a rock concert, sleek leather jacket, slim-fit trousers, and polished dragon-hide boots that gleamed with every step. He was easily the most striking of the 6 Weasley brothers, radiating a calm confidence that came with maturity. His steady demeanor and exceptional work ethic were tempered by a tolerant nature and a strong, sometimes stubborn set of opinions. All the while, he maintained a distinctive, almost avant-garde NSE of style. Behind him came Charlie, the second eldest. He stood about the same height as his twin brothers, a half-head shorter than Ron, but far more solidly built than lanky Percy. Charlie's broad face was weathered by time and sun, his skin dusted with thick, dark freckles. His muscular arms told of hard, honest work, and one bore a polished burn scar that caught the light. A true free spirit, Charlie was focused and persistent, quietly reliable, and deeply empathetic. He shared an unbreakable bond with his family. Sherlock's eyes flicked over the 2 brothers, instantly registering their appearances, and in turn, the outlines of their character. Chapter 469, Just One Look is Enough. Hello, everyone. What a pleasure to meet you all. The 3 Weasley brothers stepped into the room together. Bill and Charlie moved forward first, eager to introduce themselves to Sherlock and the others. Sherlock offered Bill a firm handshake. "I'm Bill Weasley," Bill said with a warm smile. "Ron can't stop talking about you." Sherlock's eyes twinkled. "I'm sure he told you that with just one look. I'd know everything you did today." Bill laughed. "Well, he wasn't far off." He turned to Charlie. "And this is my brother, Charlie." Charlie's grip was noticeably stronger. "So, what have we been up to this morning?" Sherlock studied their faces for a heartbeat. "You apparated here straight from bed, and judging by the way you're looking at the table, you haven't eaten yet." "Ha!" Bill chuckled, exchanging a knowing smile with Charlie. They bowed slightly to Harry, Hermione, and Sirius as well, then took their seats. No sooner had they settled than Percy's enthusiastic voice rang out from the doorway. "Dad, we just apparated in, and wow, something smells amazing." Bill and Charlie shared another quick grin and nodded at Sherlock. For them, deductions like these weren't merely a warm-up, they were simply routine. When you're absolutely famished, even plain boiled eggs and sausages can taste like a feast. Yet no sooner had they cleared half their plates than Mr. Weasley sprang to his feet, prompting startled gasps around the table. The Weasley twins braced themselves for another of their father's antics, but instead he beamed and waved energetically at a tall figure striding toward them. "Ha! Here he is, the man of the hour, Ludo," Mr. Weasley announced proudly. In walked Ludo Bagman, head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports, the very person Mr. Weasley had insisted was perfect for the task at hand. Sherlock, who had already taken note of Bill and Charlie, now studied this former Quidditch star with equal interest. Bagman wore a long Quidditch robe striped in bold yellow and black, a giant wasp splashed across his broad chest. The garment, however, clung a bit too tightly around his sizable midsection, and his nose sat slightly off-kilter. Sure signs, Sherlock mused, of a bludger or two. As Ludo approached, his easy grin and booming laughter filled the kitchen, instantly lifting the mood. It was clear why Mr. Weasley had been so eager to introduce him. Bagman had large, dark blue eyes and cropped, golden hair. "Arthur, my dear old friend, you've arrived so early," he cried, practically bouncing in place as he caught sight of Mr. Weasley. He paused to survey the camp, first the neatly pitched tent, then the roaring bonfire, and let out an admiring whistle. "Well done, you've really organized everything here. I've seen plenty of wizards who couldn't manage half as much." Just then, a handful of weary-looking ministry officials hurried past them, their robes dusted with ash. Across the clearing, someone was experimenting with fiendfire, twin tongues of violet flame leaping more than 20 feet into the night sky. Percy, determined to make a good impression, stepped forward and offered Bagman his hand. Though he'd only recently joined the Ministry of Magic, Percy already knew its inner workings. The ministry served as the self-governing authority for the wizarding community, not just in Britain, but in countries around the world, from Norway and Greece to Germany and Bulgaria. In the wider wizarding world, not every country uses the term Ministry of Magic. In Argentina, for example, magical affairs are overseen by a wizarding council, and in the United States, they fall under the Magical Congress of the United States of America, MAC-US. Though their names and internal structures differ, these bodies perform essentially the same functions as the British Ministry of Magic. The British Ministry itself dates back to the 16th century, making it one of the earliest formal magical governments in history. Today it remains the chief authority of the British wizarding community, drafting and enforcing magical law, regulating magical creatures, and administering every aspect of wizarding life in the United Kingdom. Despite the statute of secrecy that separates magical and non-magical societies, the ministry has long maintained a working relationship with the British government. Whenever a new Prime Minister takes office, the Minister for Magic presents himself at 10 Downing Street to pay courtesy calls, and the reverse is also true when a new minister is appointed. Moreover, any crisis in the magical realm that threatens to spill over into the Muggle world prompts an immediate joint meeting between the Minister for Magic and the Prime Minister, ensuring that both governments coordinate their responses swiftly and discreetly. The Minister for Magic is the highest-ranking official in the ministry and the supreme leader of the country's magical community, charged with overseeing every aspect of wizarding life. To stay fully informed, the minister regularly reviews detailed reports submitted by senior administrators and the heads of the ministry's 7 departments. Each department handles a distinct sphere of magical affairs, but none is more central than the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It is the ministry's largest branch, and with the sole exception of the Department of Mysteries, every other department interacts closely with it. Beneath each of these 7 departments lies a network of smaller bureaus and offices, giving the ministry a clear hierarchical structure. The department heads, all senior ministry officials, carry the highest authority after the minister. Among them, Ludo Bagman serves as head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports. Percy's father, Arthur Weasley, was head of the Office for the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts, a division of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. That put him 2 grades below Ludo Bagman, who headed the Department of Magical Games and Sports and ranked level with the head of Arthur's own department. To Percy, this chain of command mattered terribly. Yet neither his father nor Mr. Bagman seemed particularly fazed. It wasn't until Percy stepped forward to shake Bagman's hand that Mr. Weasley remembered to make the proper introduction. "Ludo, this is my son, Percy," he said brightly. "He just graduated this year and has taken up a post at the Ministry." "Hello, Mr. Bagman," Percy replied, offering a polite bow of his head as their hands met. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Good to meet you, young Weasley," Bagman said with a broad grin. "I've heard a bit about you from Barty." "You mean Mr. Crouch?" Percy asked, surprised. "Exactly. Good fellow, Barty. He's spoken highly of your school accomplishments." Percy felt a flush of pride. Still, he couldn't resist clarifying one last point. "Father mentioned you were on the same level as the head of magical law enforcement?" Bagman laughed. "Believe me, Percival, I don't concern myself much with who outranks whom. There's work to be done, especially when it involves stopping enchanted muggle bicycles from wandering off into traffic." Mr. Weasley chuckled, clearly relieved by Bagman's easygoing manner. For Percy, though, the formalities and hierarchies of the Ministry felt very real, and he was determined to prove himself worthy, no matter where he sat on the organizational chart. "Crouch!" Percy's face lit up at the name. "I can't believe he remembered me." Bagman shrugged casually. "Yes, though he did mix up your name a bit." He trailed off, his gaze drifting over the arriving party until it settled on a tall, dark-haired man striding toward them. His eyes widened. "Isn't that Black?" Mr. Weasley beamed. "Indeed, Sirius Black himself, the fearless warrior who stood against you-know-who, a genuine hero of the wizarding world." "Oh, I nearly forgot. Arnold just delivered them," Mr. Weasley added with a flourish. Despite his misgivings about the Ministry's higher-ups, Sirius stepped forward graciously and extended his hand to Bagman. The handshake was cordial, and Bagman, still starstruck, barely managed a nod in return. Mr. Weasley then turned to the two red-headed twins standing off to the side. "And these are Fred, no George. Wait, that's Fred on the left and George on the right. I mix you two up every time." George elbowed Fred with a grin. "See, Dad, even you can't tell us apart." Fred laughed, rolling his eyes playfully. "You got that right." Fred, pointing at George, turned to Ludo Bagman and said, "So tell me again, how do you always manage to tell us apart?" "Observation, of course," Bagman replied with a modest shrug. "Is observation really that useful?" George asked skeptically. At the mention of Bagman's talent, Bill and Charlie leaned in. Bill couldn't help himself. "Ron told me you don't just recognize someone's name. You look at a person and you can guess what they've been doing all day, their profession, their personality, even their tastes." "Exactly," Bagman said, nodding. "Take Bill here. You're a curse breaker for Gringotts in Egypt. You're calm, methodical, and exceptionally capable at what you do. You're tolerant but have firm principles, and you follow your own unique sense of style. And Charlie, you studied dragons in Romania, and your Quidditch skills are practically on par with Harry's. You cherish your freedom, you're focused and dedicated, and people find you low-key, dependable, and empathetic." "Spot on," Charlie laughed, clapping Bagman on the shoulder. Bill chuckled, too. "Okay, that's impressive, but it still doesn't prove anything on its own." Sherlock inclined his head, voice cool and measured. "Even if you'd never met us in person, surely your family would have mentioned our exploits." Ludo Bagman laughed uneasily. "Oh, Ron told me a bit, but I never expected you to deduce so much just from watching me." "Detail matters little," Sherlock replied, his gaze flicking back to Bagman. "For instance, I can already predict that your father's friend is about to propose a bet on the Gobstones Championship." Bagman blinked. "Huh? You?" Mr. Weasley seized the lull to introduce everyone. "These are my eldest sons, Bill, Charlie, and Ron. This is my daughter and youngest child, Ginny. And these are Ron's schoolmates, Sherlock Holmes and Hermione Granger, and of course Harry Potter." Bagman's face brightened into a broad smile as he complimented Ginny on her looks. He nodded politely to Sherlock and Hermione, then stiffened when Mr. Weasley spoke Harry's name. For a moment, the room held its breath. In the next instant, his gaze locked onto the lightning bolt scar etched across Harry's forehead. Chapter 470, "You will win, but victory will not be yours." In the magical world, the moment anyone hears the name Harry Potter, their eyes widen in surprise. Almost reflexively, they dart to his forehead, searching for the fabled lightning-shaped scar. Harry had grown so accustomed to this routine that when Ludo Bagman did the same thing, he barely registered it. Luckily, Bagman's scrutiny was brief, because Mr. Weasley quickly jumped in. "All right, everyone," Mr. Weasley said, clearing his throat. "Allow me to introduce." He paused dramatically, then continued in a solemn tone. "This is Ludo Bagman. You all know who he is, and thanks to him we've secured these wonderful tickets." "Arthur, it was no trouble at all," Bagman interrupted cheerfully, waving a hand dismissively. He beamed at the assembled crowd, then turned back to Mr. Weasley with a twinkle in his eye. "Say, Arthur, fancy placing a little wager on the match?" At that, every person in the room, everyone except Mr. Weasley, Mr. Bagman, and Percy, shot a startled glance at Sherlock. Once again, the boy had been right. Ludo Bagman was indeed proposing a bet. Harry had long since grown used to the looks of astonishment people wore when they heard his name. Sherlock, too, was familiar with the stunned silence that followed each of his deductions. In fact, at this moment, he was even more unfazed than Harry ever had been. Meanwhile, Ludo Bagman gave the pockets of his yellow and black robes a theatrical jiggle, making sure Mr. Weasley noticed the heavy clink of galleons. "I've already got Roddy Pontner on the other side," he announced. "He's backing Bulgaria to score first. I gave him rather generous odds, though. I'm convinced Ireland's number 3 chaser, young Agatha Timms, is the finest talent I've seen in years. She's wagered half the shares in her eel farm that the match will last a full week." Mr. Weasley paused. The man had secured them excellent seats. It would be discourteous to refuse outright. "All right, then. How about 1 galleon on Ireland to win?" "1 galleon," Bagman echoed, his tone edged with disappointment. Clearly, he'd hoped for a heftier stake. He shook off his momentary disappointment and turned back to the group with a grin. "All right, then. Just a little wager for fun. Who else wants in?" "Arthur, they're too young to be gambling," Mr. Weasley protested reflexively. Molly wouldn't. But before he could finish, Fred and George had already pounced, fingers rifling through George's robes until they produced a fat stack of galleons and sickles. 36 galleons, 18 sickles, 9 nuts from each of us, Fred announced proudly. "On Ireland to win." George raised an eyebrow. "And Victor Crumb to catch the golden snitch." Fred nodded and rummaged again. "Oh, and we're throwing in something extra." He withdrew what looked like a slightly warped wand. Percy's face went pale. Hey, what are you doing? Don't show." But it was too late. Bagman snatched the wand out of Fred's hand. The twins exchanged mischievous grins, and with a theatrical flourish, Fred tapped the wand on Bagman's sleeve. It quacked, loud as a duck, and in the space of a heartbeat transformed into a bright yellow rubber chicken. Bagman bent over in surprise, then roared with laughter. "Brilliant! I haven't seen craftsmanship like this in years." He wiped tears from his eyes. 5 galleons, and I'll take it off your hands. Count it toward your wager." Percy, slack-jawed and mortified, could only stare as Bagman tucked the squeaky fowl into his pocket. He'd meant to stop his brothers, but they'd once again beaten him at his own game. Percy Weasley stood by in growing disbelief as Ludo Bagman jingled handfuls of coins in his pockets, eyes alight at what Percy had always regarded as nothing more than worthless trinkets. He could hardly believe the spectacle. Bagman, with all the decorum of a schoolyard show-off, utterly lacking the quiet authority Percy so admired in his own head of department, Barty Crouch. Percy remained as stiff and immovable as Lee, a lamppost, tension coiling through him. Neither Bagman nor his father, Mr. Weasley, seemed to notice Percy's disapproval, until Mr. Weasley cleared his throat and addressed the twins. "Now, children, I really don't want you gambling away all your savings. Your mother—" "Oh, come on, Dad. Don't be such a spoil-sport," George Weasley interrupted with a wide grin, elbowing Fred. Before Mr. Weasley could protest further, Bagman's booming voice cut through the air. He rapped his knuckles against his pocket, sending a merry jingle echoing across the field. "They're old enough to make their own choices," he declared. "You think Ireland will win, yet you're convinced Crumb will catch the golden snitch? Preposterous. Since you're so certain, I'll give you very generous odds." Bagman whipped out a battered notebook and a spit-tipped quill, then casually listed Fred and George's names in crisp, confident strokes. Mr. Weasley hovered at his side, helpless and dismayed. "All set," Bagman announced, snapping the notebook shut. George snatched up the small parchment slip Bagman handed him and tucked it triumphantly into the front of his robes. Percy's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. This time, having just secured a hefty payout on their bets, Ludo Bagman was positively radiant. He turned to Mr. Weasley, the flickering campfire casting warm highlights across his round features. "So, Sherlock," he called out with boyish enthusiasm, "do you really think we can win this?" George reappeared at that moment, waving the betting slip for all to see. "Hang on. How did you know he'd offer us a wager in the first place?" he asked, his grin widening with playful challenge. Fred chimed in from the other side, and the entire group shifted expectantly toward Sherlock, eager to hear the school's resident detective explain his earlier deduction. After all, Sherlock had predicted from the start that Bagman would be the one to suggest a bet. Sherlock met their gazes serenely. "In truth," he said, "those two questions are really the same." He let his eyes settle on Ludo Bagman, who was still chatting animatedly with Mr. Weasley. The former Quidditch star stood tall, his round blue eyes sparkling, his rosy cheeks glowing in the firelight. His short golden hair clung to his skull, and his snug robe strained gently over a comfortably rounded stomach, testimony to a leisurely life since hanging up his broom. Sherlock nodded ever so slightly toward Bagman's feet. "Observe his gait," he explained. "There's a spring in his step, not merely from joy, but from an undercurrent of restless eagerness. That's what tipped me off." Sherlock stood by the firelight, eyes glinting as he addressed the group. "That restless energy you're seeing isn't mere vitality. It's a habit forged over years, the same signals a gambler gives off when he senses a winning hand. Think back to how he met Percy's enthusiastic introduction. Polite, almost dismissive, his attention already drifting elsewhere. That tells us his real interest wasn't in making pleasant conversation with Ministry of Magic colleagues. Then there was his laughter at our camp, calling the fire tidy and well-run. Notice how over-the-top the tone was, and how briefly he glanced up at us. That wasn't genuine praise. It was a perfunctory courtesy, a way to clear the emotional deck before he made his move. And when he spoke with your father, he leaned forward, fingers rubbing together in a barely conscious rhythm, punctuating his sentences with slight pauses. All classic tells that he was preparing his opening gambit. Sherlock paused. Flames crackled between them as everyone exchanged eager glances, leaning in. Silence stretched until Ron, unable to hold back, blurted, "And then what happened?" "Sherlock, please continue," Fred urged. "Weren't those two questions essentially the same?" George chimed in. "You still haven't told us whether we'll win." Sherlock gave them a steady look. "You will win the bet, but victory won't be yours." The twins stared at him, baffled. Sherlock quickly elaborated. "The man we're dealing with, a former Quidditch star who now heads a Ministry of Magic department, has long been entangled in gambling debts. He's perpetually on the brink of financial ruin, and the rush to recoup his losses has become second nature. Even here, in this informal encampment surrounded by a group of gullible young wizards, he couldn't resist proposing a small wager to stir some excitement." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You see, he set the terms so that you would technically win, but the conditions he attached, clauses buried in the fine print, ensure that he retains the real advantage. In the end, you'll collect your winnings, but he'll have achieved exactly the outcome he wanted." The Weasley twins exchanged glances, realization dawning. Sherlock smiled faintly. "That is why you will win the bet, yet never truly emerge victorious." "Look at those odds he put up," Sherlock said coolly, folding his arms. "Even if you beat him, he simply can't pay what he owes." Fred and George Weasley exchanged stunned looks. "No way," Fred muttered. "Mr. Bagman's a department head at the Ministry of Magic. He can't be that reckless." Harry shot them a knowing grin. "You two always assume everyone else plays fair." Sherlock shook his head. "Bagman's a compulsive gambler. It's as apparent as someone who steals on impulse. He's buried under massive debts, and this Quidditch World Cup is his last hope to reel in enough gold to clear his name. His position won't protect him from dodging a bet." George stood so abruptly his stool nearly tipped. "Then I'm going to get our money back." Hermione's brow furrowed. "Do you really think you can?" "If Sherlock's right, Bagman doesn't have a galleon to spare, let alone enough to cover a winning bet." Sherlock offered a sly smile. This is precisely the moment to press him. Desperate men will do almost anything to save face. If you want your winnings, you need to corner him now, before he disappears into his debts for good. Fred nodded, determination flaring in his eyes. All right, then. Let's pay Mr. Bagman a visit and remind him what it means to keep his word. They gathered their courage and their purses and set off toward the grandstands, where Cornelius Fudge's old colleague was about to learn that some debts must be honored, no matter the cost. With Mr. Weasley standing beside him, Bagman would agree out of politeness, and once he slipped away, it would be impossible to change his mind. The Weasley twins still trusted Sherlock's methods implicitly, so Fred exchanged a determined look with George. "I'm going," he announced. Without another word, Fred wove through the crowd and found Ludo Bagman in the midst of an animated conversation with Mr. Weasley. Drawing a deep breath, he laid out his plan as clearly and quickly as he could. Bagman's eyes went wide, and his mouth dropped open in stunned silence. Mr. Weasley's enthusiastic chatter abruptly forgotten. Chapter 471, The Missing Witch. The chatter in the leaky cauldron's back room fell silent the moment Ludo Bagman realized Fred Weasley wanted to withdraw his bet. He and Mr. Weasley had been laughing and reminiscing over pumpkin juice when Fred stepped forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Bagman," Fred said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'd like to, cancel my wager." Bagman's rosy cheeks drained of color. He stared at Fred, open-mouthed. "Why on earth would you do that, lad?" Fred shifted his weight, glancing at his twin brother George, who raised an eyebrow in silent support. Fred squared his shoulders. "We've talked it over, and Dad was right. You're never too young to lose it all, sir. Mum will absolutely skin us alive if she finds out we gambled." Bagman frowned, torn between amusement and annoyance. No one liked having their snacks snatched away mid-bite, but the boy seemed sincere. "Your mother will kill you, you say?" "Yes, sir." Fred nodded emphatically. He pressed his hands together, pleading, "Please, Mr. Bagman, let us out of it." "Pulling out now?" Bagman's voice carried the hint of a groan. "After all my promises, after all the fanfare, how can I let you break your word?" From across the table, Percy Weasley leaned in, his expression grave. He whispered under his breath, "Father's reputation and Mr. Bagman's depends on these wagers. You can't just back out." Fred swallowed. He could feel George's impatient foot tapping behind him, but Percy had a point. Still, he couldn't risk disgracing the family, or worse, facing their mum's fury. "I understand, Percy," he hissed back. Then, turning to Bagman, he went on in a quieter but determined tone. "My brother and I are very sorry, sir, but please, this is our final answer." Bagman folded his arms and sighed, rubbing his temples. The room hung on his reaction, every pair of eyes fixed on the boy who had just gambled with goblin gold and hoped to walk away without a scratch. At last, Bagman's face softened. "Very well, Fred Weasley. I'll let you off, this once, but I'll be keeping a close eye on you at the Quidditch World Cup. No disappearing acts, you hear?" Fred beamed. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As relief flooded through him, George clapped Fred on the back, while Percy gave him a warning look. "You'd better not test this again." Mr. Weasley, who had been watching the exchange with pride, squeezed Fred's shoulder. "Let's just enjoy our pumpkin juice in peace," Mr. Weasley said, settling back into his seat. And for the moment, at least, that's precisely what they did. Fred and George Weasley stood in the Ministry's Games and Sports office, arms folded, as Ludo Bagman eyed the wand in his hand with thinly veiled suspicion. Earlier, he'd paid them 5 galleons for what he'd been told was a deluxe spell deflection wand. Now he claimed it didn't live up to the brochure's promises, and he wanted his money back. "Going back on our deal after you've already accepted the wand?" Fred asked sharply. Bagman bristled. "I demand a refund. This thing barely does a thing." "Then give us our money," Fred said coolly. "Unless you'd rather we marched straight over to Mum. And believe me, you don't want Molly Weasley furious at the Ministry." At Fred's dare, Mr. Weasley cleared his throat. "Yes, Ludo, once Molly's cross, even I get a fright." Swallowing hard, Bagman fished a heavy pouch from his pocket. He counted out 36 galleons, 18 sickles, and 9 nuts, dropping the coins onto the desk with a clatter. "There, I haven't even properly tried it yet." "Keep the wand," George said quickly. "If it truly won't work, Mum'll hardly notice it's lost." Bagman waved a hand. "Fine, fine. Let's say it's still worth the 5 galleons. I'll write you a new receipt. He grabbed a stub of parchment and a quill, scribbling furiously before handing it to the twins. Here you go, George. George peered at the paper. Thanks, but I'm Fred. Caught off guard, Bagman glanced at Mr. Weasley. But Arthur just said, We're twins, George explained with a grin. Our parents mix us up all the time. We're used to it. Mr. Weasley patted Fred's shoulder, smiling. Doesn't matter which one of you gets the receipt, as long as we're all square. Ludo Bagman, thoroughly mollified, tucked the defective wand into his robes and hurried off. The twins exchanged triumphant looks, pocketed their galleons, and followed their father out of the office. Another successful Weasley enterprise, and not a drop of trouble too big to handle. Mr. Weasley cleared his throat, offering a sheepish smile. Oh, no matter. Let's talk about something else. Arthur, could I ask a favor of you? Fred's quiet retrieval of the galleons had been a cause for genuine relief. At least, Mr. Weasley thought so. He didn't realize Fred's sudden change of heart came from Sherlock's careful analysis. He simply knew his son wasn't gambling away every nut in his pocket. Now, though, hearing Bagman's earnest request, he leaned forward, curiosity piqued. A favor? What might that be, Ludo? Bagman sank back in his chair, the cheer fading from his expression. I've been trying to track down Barty Crouch. Percy, who'd been bristling at Bagman's earlier teasing of his brothers, froze for an instant, then sprang to life at the mention of Crouch. But Bagman carried on. There's a wizard in Bulgaria, my counterpart, so to speak, who keeps sending me the most perplexing proposals in his native tongue. I've been assured that Mr. Crouch can sort it all out. He said to speak 150 languages. Mr. Crouch? Percy's excitement burst forth. He speaks 200 languages, merpeople, Turkey, even troll dialect. Right, merpeople, giant turkeys, Fred interrupted with a roll of his eyes. Honestly, Percy, everyone speaks troll. Percy bristled at the interruption, but Bagman hummed thoughtfully. 150, 200, it's all impressive. I just know I need his help. If anyone can translate Bulgarian bureaucrat speak, it's Barty Crouch. Mr. Weasley tapped his fingers on the table. All right, I'll see what I can find out. Do you have any idea where he might be at the moment? Bagman brightened. That's the tricky part. He travels constantly, but if anyone can hunt him down, it's Arthur Weasley. Fred exchanged a glance with George, both of them still smarting from Percy's attempt to stop Fred from reclaiming his stake earlier. Yet there was something oddly hopeful in Bagman's plea, and Mr. Weasley's eyes shone with the promise of a new puzzle to solve. Leave it with me, Arthur said, rising to his feet. I'll send word the moment I hear anything. With a relieved nod, Bagman gathered his things, while Percy quivered with the thrill of impending linguistics gossip. And Fred, though outwardly indifferent, couldn't help the small, satisfied grin tugging at his lips. Fred couldn't resist one last barb. Honestly, all you ever do is point and grunt. 3 of the younger wizards gathered closest to the fire erupted into laughter. Percy's face turned crimson. He shot his twin a furious look, then jabbed at the embers with his walking stick until the kettle set above them began to bubble again. Just then, Ludo Bagman settled onto the grass beside Percy. Fred and Sherlock, having returned to one another's side, exchanged a private smirk, but wisely let the others carry on. They leaned back to watch. Ludo, Percy called, waving the end of his half-eaten sausage. Want this? Thanks, I'm starving. Bagman took it gratefully, chewing with exaggerated relish. Percy eased himself against a log, watching the steam rise from the kettle. Any word on Bertha Jorkins? Bagman shook his head, still munching. Not a whisper. He swallowed, then added with a knowing shrug. But don't worry, she'll turn up when the time's right. Poor Bertha's memory is like a sieve with a hole in the bottom, and her sense of direction has always been terrible. I'll bet she's wandered off again. One of these October mornings, she'll stroll back into the office, convinced it's still July. Fred and Sherlock simply exchanged said glances as the kettle's whistle cut through the night air. The search for Bertha could wait a little longer. Right now, they were quite content to enjoy the firelight and good company. Here is the revised, polished version of the scene. Believe it or not, Sherlock said softly. I believe you. Ron frowned. What's going on with Bertha Jorkins? He glanced at his older brothers, Bill and Charlie. She's a witch at the Ministry of Magic, assigned to the Department of Magical Games and Sports. That's where Ludo Bagman works. Bill lowered his voice. She went to Albania on holiday this summer and never came back. It's been over a month. Sherlock's eyebrow shot up. A month? And Bagman's not even worried? Well, Ron admitted, Jorkins is notoriously absent-minded. The whole ministry knows it. She's been shuffled from one department to another for years, always a little burdensome. Eventually, she landed with Bagman. Seeing Sherlock's expression grow darker, Charlie chimed in. Honestly, you can't blame Bagman for shrugging. She's pulled disappearances like this before, wandering off for a week or two, and then turning up again with no memory of where she's been. Sherlock listened to Bill and Charlie's account, but he couldn't shake the memory of Bagman's dismissive tone. The careless attitude troubled him far more than the story itself. This version clarifies the characters' relationships, tightens the dialogue, and ensures a smooth, natural flow for an English-speaking audience. Mr. Weasley glanced anxiously at Ludo Bagman. "Don't you think we ought to send someone out to look for her?" he ventured. Before Bagman could answer, Percy wisely slipped a steaming cup of tea into his hands. Bagman took it with relief, chuckling. "Thanks, Percy. You know, Barty Crouch has always been the first to call for order, but right now we're too short-handed for a proper search. Speaking of him, here he comes." A sharp crack split the night air, and a wizard appeared beside their bonfire in a puff of smoke. Bagman waved a casual hand. "Everyone, this is Barty Crouch, head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation and, Percy's direct superior." Sherlock spared Crouch a single, appraising glance and immediately understood Percy's earlier grimace at the name. Where Bagman lounged on the grass in his well-worn WASP robes, Crouch looked every inch the bureaucrat. In his 50s, he stood ramrod straight, shoulders squared, every crease in his crisply tailored suit, and perfectly knotted tie, locked in place as though by magic. Barty Crouch's short black hair was parted with such precision it looked drawn by a ruler, and his little toothbrush mustache seemed trimmed to exacting standards. His shoes shone like polished glass. Honestly, you'd never guess he was a wizard by his appearance alone. He might as well be a bank manager, Harry whispered to Sherlock. Sherlock nodded. Crouch's fastidiousness set him apart from the other wizards they'd encountered at the Ministry of Magic. Almost eccentric, really. Yet in that first glance, Sherlock could sense an undercurrent of agitation in him. Another secret, perhaps? Hogwarts students all had their mysteries, but for a senior ministry official to be on edge. Just then, seeing Mr. Crouch lift his head, Harry and Sherlock braced themselves for what would come next. Ludo Bagman strolled over, beaming, and patted the grass beside Barty Crouch. "Come on, sit down and take a breather, Barty." Crouch shook his head, impatience just showing at the edges of his voice. "No, thanks, Ludo. I've been hunting you down. The Bulgarians want us to add 12 more seats to the top box." "Ah, so that's what they meant," Bagman exclaimed. "I thought the fellow was asking to borrow my tweezers. His accent was so thick, I could barely make out a thing." Percy Weatherby's ears pricked up the moment he spotted his superior. He practically vaulted forward, then forced himself into an over-the-top bow that bent him almost double. "Mr. Crouch, can I get you a cup of tea, sir?" Crouch looked at Percy, mildly surprised, and gave a curt nod. "Yes, please. Thank you, Weatherby." Harry, Hermione, Ron, and Ginny exchanged grins and stifled their laughter. Bill and Charlie, although far more disciplined, both sat a little stiffer than before. Fred and George, however, were far less restrained. They erupted in laughter, nearly spraying tea from their cups. As Bagman had just quipped, Crouch had even mangled Percy's surname. For a moment, the table fell uncomfortably silent. Everyone seemed unsettled except Sherlock and Sirius. Sherlock waved it off as trivial. He saw no need to make a fuss over a simple slip of the tongue. Sirius, though, was another story. He and Barty Crouch shared a complicated past, and from the instant Crouch apparated into the room, Sirius stood with his arms crossed, his gaze locked onto Crouch with a clear, unspoken challenge. Chapter 472, One for Everyone. Barty Crouch currently served as head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation at the Ministry of Magic. A stern and proper wizard, he was fluent in several languages and had previously led the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the ministry's largest division. More than a decade ago, during the height of the Wizarding War, Crouch had been one of the staunchest advocates for uncompromising action against Lord Voldemort and his Death Eaters. His unwavering stance made him the figurehead of the magical world's hawkish faction. When victory finally came, few were surprised that Crouch emerged with the people's trust firmly in his corner. After all, a man who refused to back down in the face of overwhelming odds seemed ideally suited to lead the wizarding community into a safer future. In the chaotic months that followed Voldemort's defeat, his reputation stood unmatched, and many believed it was only a matter of time before he ascended to the office of Minister for Magic. Among the field of candidates, Barty Crouch appeared the most promising of all. During the height of the First Wizarding War, Minister Barty Crouch Sr., a hardliner who believed the ministry must show strength at any cost, banished Sirius Black to Azkaban without so much as a trial. More than 10 years have passed since that fateful decree, and now the two men have met again. Standing at the edge of the ministry's grand atrium, watched by Arthur Weasley and Ludo Bagman, their reunion feels palpably tense. On the surface, Crouch greets Sirius with polite formality, and Sirius returns the gesture. Yet neither man can entirely mask the past. Sirius, stubborn even by the standards of his own proud House of Black, refuses to lean on his noble lineage for sympathy. Still, the set of his jaw speaks of old resentments. Once, he had mistakenly trusted Peter Pettigrew, advising James and Lily Potter to make Pettigrew their secret keeper at the last moment. And that single misjudgment led to their deaths and his own years in the nightmare of Azkaban. When Crouch ordered his imprisonment, Sirius made no protest. In his mind, any appeal would have been swallowed by the ministry's wartime hysteria. Crouch, for his part, viewed Sirius's silence as confirmation that no legal argument could have swayed the order. "You said nothing," Crouch once remarked, and truly, it wouldn't have mattered. Now, standing face to face, both men maintain courteous tones, but their eyes reveal the scars beneath. Arthur and Ludo exchange uneasy glances, aware that, though the war is long over, the tension between prisoner and jailer has not been resolved. Each holds his ground, Sirius with Black family pride, Crouch with unyielding conviction, and the chasm between them remains as wide as ever. Everyone was certain that Sirius Black had betrayed James and Lily Potter to Lord Voldemort, resulting in their deaths, and that he'd gravely injured Peter Pettigrew in the process. The evidence had been so damning that no trial was deemed necessary. Black's execution was swift and unquestioned. Not a single voice raised an objection. It would take another 12 years for the truth to surface and for Black's name to be cleared. By then, Barty Crouch Jr., the man who'd led the charge against Black, had fallen from grace himself, reassigned from his post as the ministry's rising star to a desk in the Department of International Magical Cooperation. He must have regretted his role in the miscarriage of justice. But compared to the crisis that would soon engulf the wizarding world, his personal remorse seemed a footnote. So when Crouch and Arthur Weasley finally encountered each other at a recent gathering, their exchange was curt but civil, and the icy tension Mr. Weasley and Ludo Bagman had feared never materialized. Crouch's one slip, calling Percy Weathery instead of Weasley, went largely unnoticed, save by Sherlock Holmes and Sirius Black, who shared a wry look. Percy himself turned as red as his hair and pretended to scrutinize the teapot's spout rather than admit his embarrassment. "By the way," Crouch said, leaning toward Mr. Weasley, "there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Barty Crouch fixed his gaze on Arthur Weasley. "Ali Bashir has issued a formal challenge. He wants to discuss your ban on flying carpets." Arthur sighed so heavily the cloak by the fireplace rustled. "I sent him an owl about this last week. I've told him countless times that flying carpets are classified as Muggle artifacts on the Register of Prescribed Magical Objects. Yet does he listen? Of course not." "I doubt he'll give up," Crouch replied, accepting a cup of tea from Percy, who stood ready to serve. Albert Runcorn Bagman leaned forward. "But carpet travel can't replace broomsticks here in Britain, surely?" "Ali Bashir insists there's a market for safe, family-sized aerial transport," Crouch said. "My grandfather once owned an Axminster carpet that seated 12 people. That was before the ban, of course." Sherlock Holmes, who had been watching Crouch with keen interest, raised an eyebrow. Crouch's casual mention of his ancestors' obedience suggested there was more to the story. So, Barty, have you been particularly busy of late? As the last echoes of the carpet debate died away, Bagman seized the moment. Yes. How are preparations for the Quidditch World Cup coming along, Barty? Indeed. Quite busy, Crouch admitted, settling back into his chair and preparing to brief them on the cup's finer points. Barty Crouch leaned back in his chair, voice cool and measured. Coordinating portkeys across 5 continents isn't exactly a walk in the park, Ludo. Ludo Bagman grinned, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his robe. Now, Barty, if this were easy, where would the fun be? Arthur Weasley cleared his throat, glancing between them. I take it you're all looking forward to the end of this, aren't you? Bagman's eyes lit up. Looking forward to it? I've never been happier. This whole thing's been a blast. Crouch's eyebrow rose. That's not quite what I heard. Remember, we agreed not to announce anything until every last detail was settled. Details. Schmeetails. Bagman waved a dismissive hand. They've signed the contracts, haven't they? They've agreed to compete, haven't they? And it's taking place at Hogwarts. Those kids will find out soon enough. Crouch cut him off with a sharp look. Ludo, enough. We're due to meet the Bulgarian delegation now. He turned to Percy, who'd been standing by with a tray. Thank you for the tea, Weasley. With a quick nod, Percy accepted the empty cup back from Crouch. Bagman hurried to his feet, gulping down the last of his brew, the silver galleons in his pockets jingling merrily as they all filed out of the room. We'll see you later. Arthur, you two are in the top box. Me, you, and Mr. Black over there. Cornelius has arranged the best seats for you all. He winked and grinned. I'll be doing the commentary, so sit back and enjoy the show. With another enthusiastic wave, he vanished in a swirl of mist alongside Barty Crouch, who'd only given a polite nod before apparating away. What's going on at Hogwarts now, Dad? Fred asked immediately, ignoring the urge to mock Percy for the umpteenth time over being called weathery. What did they mean? What's about to happen there? You'll find out soon enough, Mr. Weasley said, smiling but clearly determined to keep mum. It's classified until the Ministry makes an official announcement. Percy straightened his posture. Mr. Crouch was absolutely right. We shouldn't blurt out confidential information. Fred rolled his eyes. Oh, please. Give it a rest, Weathery. Laughter rippled through the group, and the air brimmed with good spirits once more. Percy frowned and fell silent. Sherlock studied him for a moment before speaking in his trademark calm. If I were you, Percy, I'd point out his mistake the moment it happens, rather than letting it pass. Percy looked up, startled. But how? How can I correct a leader in front of everyone? Sherlock met his gaze without answering further. Time drifted on. Noon became afternoon. Afternoon gave way to evening, and an electric buzz of anticipation settled over the campsite. Even the warm summer breeze felt charged, as if nature itself awaited something extraordinary. When twilight deepened into night and tens of thousands of eager wizards stood restless in the dark, the last vestiges of official restraint finally crumbled. The Ministry of Magic, unable to hold back the tide, quietly withdrew its objections, and magic, at long last recognized, bloomed everywhere. Every few paces, vendors apparated into view, carrying trays or pushing carts brimming with marvels. Tiny replicas of the legendary firebolt broom soared overhead, weaving loops in midsummer air. Colorful flags representing both nations whispered their anthems whenever they were waved. Emerald green top hats, crowned with mechanical shamrocks, twirled and bobbed in the breeze. The darkness had given way to a kaleidoscope of light, sound, and possibility, and the night was only just beginning. Souvenirs of every kind overflowed the vendor stalls. Roaring sashes, one embroidered with a green shamrock for Ireland, the other with a red lion for Bulgaria, were an instant hit, the lions literally letting out a triumphant roar whenever someone cheered. Alongside them, rose-shaped badges glowed in their respective team colors. Emerald for Ireland, ruby for Bulgaria, and would enthusiastically announce each player's name at the press of a pin. And then there were the collectible figurines, tiny, detailed replicas of famous Quidditch stars that strode back and forth in the palm of your hand, heads held high. The runaway bestseller, unsurprisingly, was the action figure of Bulgaria's own seeker, Victor Krum. Harry watched, wide-eyed. I thought apparition was supposed to be really advanced magic. Why does everyone seem to be doing it here? Sirius ruffled his godson's hair and chuckled. Apparition is tricky, sure, but mostly because the ministry won't even teach you until you're 17. If we're talking pure difficulty, learning to become an animagus or mastering the Patronus charm is far more challenging. Sherlock, who'd sidled up to listen, added with a grin, and you've got to factor in survivor bias. Every wizard able to apparate risked missing this World Cup. It's natural they'd all be here. Those who don't want to be seen simply aren't seen, their friend concluded. Harry absorbed this new insight with a nod. Ginny, standing at his side, offered the same quiet assent. Don't go confusing that with happiness bias, Ron piped up before Harry could speak. It's survivor bias, Ron, Hermione cut in, her tone equal parts exasperation and amusement. But honestly, who cares? It's shopping time. Without waiting for objections, Ron swept a hand toward the rows of vendor carts. I've been saving my pocket money all summer for this. He pounced on a dancing shamrock hat and a large green rose-shaped badge, undeniable signs of Team Ireland fervor. Then, in a curious twist, he also grabbed a tiny figurine of Victor Krum, the Bulgarian seeker. Ron held the miniature Krum aloft, delighting in the way the little figure glowered up at the oversized shamrock badge. Hermione watched with a frown. She'd never been a fan of the Bulgarian Quidditch star. Meanwhile, Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione wandered past the souvenir stalls without buying a thing. The trio shared a practical streak that made them far less interested in flashy trinkets and more inclined towards sensible, or at least cost-effective choices. Before anyone could comment further, Harry's eyes lit up. Hey, come look at this, he called, already racing toward the next cart, curiosity, and perhaps a bit of mischief, in tow. The wizard vendor's cart was piled high with devices that looked like oversized binoculars, but were festooned with countless knobs, levers, and little glass lenses. Omnioculars, folks, he called out, apparently oblivious to the famous magical world savior standing in front of him. Turning eagerly to Harry, Anton, these let you replay every moment of a Quidditch match in crystal-clear slow motion, every dive, every goal, every near miss. Want a quick tactical breakdown? They'll flash up instant analysis, too, and at just 10 galleons apiece, they're a steal, no haggling needed. Ron groaned and gave his dancing shamrock hat a rueful poke. If only I hadn't blown all my money on this ridiculous thing, he muttered, his eyes lingering on the omnioculars. He clearly wanted one, but his empty coin pouch told a different story. Short on galleons, eh? The vendor said with a sympathetic grin. Not to worry, grab 2 and share them among yourselves. Split the cost 3 ways, and it works out to just over 3 galleons each. Deal? You can record any match you watch through these, and the footage never disappears. Share them? Are you kidding me? Sirius cut in, voice low but urgent. If the foreigners over there see us splitting one, they'll think we can't afford our own. The vendor blinked at the strikingly handsome wizard. He knew full well that 10 galleons for a pair of omnioculars was steep. The manufacturing costs were high, and he'd paid dearly for the right to sell them here. There was no profit if he dropped the price. Encouraging group purchases was the only way to move stock, and he'd already convinced several buyers to go in together. He hadn't expected such a reaction from Sirius. No, really, they're identical, the vendor said hastily, nodding toward the other buyers. Even those foreign wizards over there are sharing theirs. Sirius's dark eyes narrowed. Identical or not, I don't want to look like we can't scrape together 10 galleons each. He folded his arms, firmly blocking the stall's countertop. The vendor opened his mouth to protest, but saw the resolve in Sirius's posture. With a reluctant sigh, he undid the small case behind him. Fine, he said, 10 galleons for a pair, yours alone. Sirius allowed a thin smile. That's better. As he handed over the coins, the vendor passed him the sleek, polished omnioculars. Sirius lifted them appreciatively, already picturing the matches he'd save and watch far from prying eyes. The wizard vendor was already clutching his temples when Sirius spoke up, his voice brimming with excitement. 1 pair of omnioculars won't be enough for all of us. Run back and fetch 1 set for each person. Chapter 473. Because he is Holmes. At Sirius's firm insistence, every one of the 5 young wizards present, Sherlock, Harry, Hermione, Ron, and Ginny, left the shop clutching a brand-new panoramic telescope equipped with recording, playback, and analysis functions, and Sirius wasn't about to leave his older brothers and the Weasley twins empty-handed. He sent Ron and Ginny back to fetch one apiece for Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred, and George as well. The itinerant peddler wizard watched the transaction with rapture. He clutched the heavy money bag filled with galleons as if it were a priceless relic, his grin stretching nearly from ear to ear. That single sale had earned him a three-figure sum, more than half a month's typical income, in one go. As for the brusque, no-nonsense attitude Sirius had shown earlier, the pile of glimmering gold in the peddler's hands told him exactly how high a price some customers were willing to pay, and how well they were treated in return. The peddler wizard fussed over the telescopes, carefully wrapping each one and murmuring, "Thank you for your patronage, and please come again." His obsequiousness stood in stark contrast to the curt indifference he'd shown ordinary customers just minutes before. Only Harry and Hermione grasped the real reason for Sirius's sudden largesse. They exchanged a knowing glance. Each could see it reflected in the other's eyes. Sirius's display of near nouveau rich extravagance wasn't about showing off. It was about sparing Ron and Ginny any embarrassment. The telescope itself was a thing of beauty. Its barrel gleamed pure silver white, filigreed with delicate magical runes, and the focusing knob clicked softly into place, a testament to the finest craftsmanship. Yet 10 galleons was no small sum for an ordinary wizarding family, especially not for the Weasleys, who stretched every nut and sickle to care for 7 children. Had Sirius merely offered to buy one telescope out of pocket, Ron and Ginny might have hesitated, mindful of the debt it would place on their family. But after everything that had happened today, this gift carried a different weight. It wasn't charity. It was a gesture of friendship and gratitude, impossible to refuse. Sirius Black's sudden, almost CEO-like authority had left Ron and Ginny speechless. Before they even had a chance to refuse, they found themselves gratefully accepting his offer. Even after the peddler wizard ambled off in high spirits, the two siblings exchanged embarrassed glances. "Sirius, isn't that a bit much?" Ron whispered. After all, their parents had just spent 70 galleons on treats, 10 galleons apiece for the 7 Weasley children. Sirius waved a dismissive hand. "What are you talking about? I'm your elder. Of course I should spoil my juniors a little. Unless—" He paused, a mischievous glint lighting his eyes as he looked from Ron to Ginny. "Unless you'd rather have Aunt Molly decide who's senior in this family. In that case, Ron, you're my cousin, and Ginny, you're my cousin, which means Harry would have to call you uncle and auntie." Ginny's cheeks flamed. I don't want to be Harry's auntie," she blurted, her face crimson. Ron, too, turned as red as his hair, though his reasons for blushing were a bit more complicated. Ginny winced inwardly at the idea of calling Sirius her uncle. A distant cousin might be fun, almost exotic, but an aunt? That would put her a full generation above Harry and doom her little crush before it even began. Ron, on the other hand, was fidgeting with genuine relief. He'd always been keenly aware that Harry was wealthy. He'd inherited a tidy fortune from his parents, and the thought of accepting an expensive gift directly from Harry had made him uneasy. But a present from Sirius, an elder in the family, felt perfectly natural. Elders gave gifts to juniors. That was how it worked. Ron's tension evaporated in an instant as he grinned and said, "You're right. Of course it makes sense." Picking up the telescope, he aimed it at the cluster of tents in the distance. The moment the image snapped into focus, his eyes lit up, and any lingering awkwardness disappeared. While the rest of the Weasley brood could be notoriously sensitive about money, Ron, and indeed Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione, handled the situation with absolute ease. They didn't care how many galleons they'd been given. What mattered was the thought behind the gift. "Oh, thank you, Sirius," Hermione said, accepting the panoramic telescope he offered. Harry took his own with a broad smile and a grateful nod. Hermione added, "Let me dash and buy a program for everyone. It's just over by that stall." When they returned to the tent, the rest of the Weasleys were dotted in green supporters badges, and Mr. Weasley was proudly waving an Ireland flag. It was clear they were all cheering for the Irish team. Only Percy stood aloof, wearing nothing but his usual reserve. He simply didn't care for souvenirs. The younger Weasleys tore into Sirius's parcels with delighted squeals, but Percy, empty-handed and flush-cheeked, hesitated before managing a quiet, "Thank you, Sirius. Thank you, Harry." He might have found little use for trinkets and keepsakes, but a good quality telescope? That was undeniably practical. "Sirius, you really went overboard," Mr. Weasley chided with a fond shake of his head. "Far too generous, if you ask me." Mr. Weasley glanced around sheepishly as he handed out the panoramic telescopes to his 7 children. "Well," he began, scratching the back of his neck, "it makes sense for the younger ones, but Bill, Charlie, and Percy are all grown up. Am I really supposed to?" "Arthur, stop it!" Sirius Black cut in with a booming laugh and a hearty clap on his shoulder. "Since when does being an adult spoil the fun of a gift? No matter how old they get, they're still our juniors. Do you think I hesitated a moment before buying mischief for Remus?" Mr. Weasley's grin widened, and he fell silent. Sirius had won that round. Just then, a deep, resonant gong rolled through the forest. Like a starter's pistol, it echoed between the trees, and in the next instant thousands of lanterns, red and green, blossomed overhead, illuminating a winding path toward the stadium. "That's our signal," Mr. Weasley announced, eyes alight with excitement. "Move it, everyone. Time to go." "Yay!" the children cheered, quickly gathering their things. The Quidditch World Cup final was about to begin at last. Mr. Weasley led the way down the lantern-lit trail, Sirius strolling beside him with his hands tucked comfortably into his pockets, both of them grinning at the spectacle before them. He was arguably the most muggle-like wizard there, aside from Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione. Clutching their purchases, everyone pressed eagerly along the lantern-lit path into the heart of the forest. All around them, thousands of witches and wizards flowed like a vibrant river, shouts and laughter rippling through the night, with the occasional burst of song punctuating the air. The sheer excitement proved infectious. Almost before they realized it, everyone was grinning. Yet when Harry glanced at Sherlock at his side, he found only a faint, measured smile, an expression that seemed impervious to the surrounding revelry. "Never let emotions cloud your judgment, Harry." Sherlock had anticipated Harry's unspoken thought. When Harry turned to him, he continued, "Emotions can be a dangerous liability." "Sherlock, you're starting to sound like Moody," Sirius teased with a grin. "He's always on high alert," Sirius added over his shoulder as they walked. "That's a different kind of danger," Sherlock said, his voice calm but firm. "Moody's threats come from the world around him. Mine originate from within." Their laughter and banter bounced among the trees for the next 20 minutes. Then, at last, they emerged into a wide clearing and stopped dead in their tracks. Before them loomed the golden ramparts of a colossal stadium. Even from this angle, they could glimpse enough of its soaring walls to know it could contain the equivalent of 10 cathedrals. "It must hold 100,000 spectators," Harry whispered, awed. One of the Ministry of Magic officials, who had supervised its construction, Mr. Radcliffe, stepped forward. With a courteous nod, he offered to lead them through the towering gates and reveal the wonders hidden inside. Arthur Weasley couldn't hide his pride as he addressed the group. 500 Ministry employees spent an entire year preparing this site. Believe it or not, we've woven Muggle-repelling charms into every brick and beam. If a Muggle gets within a mile, they're suddenly seized by a pressing errand. Off they dash, convinced they've left the kettle on or an important appointment awaiting them. He paused, glancing awkwardly at the ancient stonework around them. "God bless them," he added sheepishly, as if embarrassed that so grand a magical undertaking might be inconveniencing everyday folk. Sherlock Holmes raised a single brow, taking it all in. The gulf between a wizard and an ordinary person, he thought, was staggering. Even the fiercest, most rigorously trained soldier, armor gleaming, sword at the ready, would stand no chance against a spellcaster who could lay them low at 30 paces. Granted, matters might be different if the swordsman managed to close the distance unchallenged. A blade slipping past defenses spelled certain disaster for the wizard. But in practice, before any mortal warrior could draw a breath, a wizard's hex or curse would have already done its work. And here, it wasn't just raw power at play, but the ability to warp perception itself. Too formidable, too absolute. Sherlock's eyes flicked back to Weasley. This enchanted fortress was proof. Between the two worlds, magical and muggle, The chasm was far deeper than mere differences in technology or training. It lay in the very way wizards could reshape reality, bending minds as easily as wands. And that, he decided, was a disparity no sword or gun could ever redress. Sherlock stared ahead, mulling over a troubling what-if. What would he do if he'd never possessed a drop of magical talent and still faced a crime in the wizarding world? A killing curse that leaves no trace. Would even his famed powers of deduction help him then? "Hey, Sherlock, are you all right?" Hermione's voice drew him back. She'd been watching him drift off. "Just mapping out some parallels between the Muggle and magical worlds," he lied, closing his notebook. "Nothing to worry about." He gave a small nod and pointed. "We're here." Mr. Weasley, ever the enthusiastic host, led them to the stadium entrance. A throng of witches and wizards jostled around, arms waving, voices rising. "First-class tickets!" someone yelled, and cheers rippled through the crowd. A ministry witch at the gate recognized Arthur immediately. She leaned close, peered at the tickets in Sirius's and Arthur's hands, then smiled. "Top box. Up those stairs, please. Arthur, if you'll guide your guests to the very top, that's your spot." They stepped onto the broad staircase, where a plush crimson carpet ran up each step. Its deep hue and soft pile lent the ascent an exquisite, almost ceremonious air as they climbed toward their place in the stadium's highest eyrie. They followed the witch's directions up the stadium's outer steps, moving with the steady surge of spectators until they reached the very top. As Mr. Weasley had promised, Ludo Bagman really had secured them the best box in the house. Perched at the highest point and facing the golden goalposts head-on, their little enclosure offered a completely unobstructed view of the pitch below. Though described as small, the box comfortably held about 20 purple and gilded chairs arranged in 2 neat rows. Sherlock, Harry, Hermione, and Sirius took their places beside the Weasleys in the front row. Beneath them, 100,000 wizards slowly filled the tiered seats that ringed the oval field, rising like a giant purple wave. The grass looked impossibly smooth, velvet green, and at each end stood 3 towering hoops, 50 feet high. To their right hung the enormous scoreboard, its gold and letters constantly cycling through advertisements. The current message read, "Cornflower broomsticks, family-friendly, safe, reliable, with built-in anti-theft buzzer. Scours all-purpose magical mess remover, eradicate stains in an instant. Madame Malkin's robes for every occasion, now at boutiques in London, Paris, and Hogsmeade." The enchanted billboards flashed their endorsements above the Quidditch pitch, no different in purpose from any Muggle advertisement. Only the magic made them more vivid, more attention-grabbing. Harry tore his gaze away from the scrolling slogans just as Sherlock finished his rapid survey of the stadium and their private box. It was still early. Apart from their group, only one other magical creature occupied the suite. In the second-to-last seat of the row behind them sat a tiny figure, so small its stubby legs barely reached the chair in front. A rough tea towel draped over its shoulders served as a makeshift robe, and its face was buried deep in its hands. Whatever movements it made were furtive, almost furtive, as though it were hiding from the world. Harry leaned forward, eyes widening at the creature's unusually long, bat-like ears. "Dobby?" he whispered, disbelief cracking his voice. Sherlock offered a faint, amused smile. "No, my dear Harry, not the house elf you're thinking of." At that, the little being peeled its fingers away from its face and lifted its head, revealing wide, curious eyes. Harry stared at the creature's enormous brown eyes and its bulbous, tomato-sized nose, and at once he understood Sherlock's words. This certainly wasn't Dobby, yet it was unquestionably another house elf. Up until now, Harry had only known 2, Dobby, the Malfoy family elf who once risked everything to warn him, and Creature, the ancient servant of the Black household. To most wizards, or muggles for that matter, house elves might all look the same, unless they possessed an especially distinctive feature. Given Creature's advanced age, mistaking this elf for Dobby was hardly surprising. As for how Sherlock could tell them apart even with the elf's face partly hidden, well, he was Sherlock Holmes after all. Chapter 474, The House Elf, the Minister, and the Great Exposure. The plush velvet seats of the top box at the Quidditch World Cup glowed softly in the half-light, while the stadium floodlights outside slowly blinked on, bathing the pitch in pale brilliance. Sherlock Holmes leaned forward, whispering so only Harry could hear, "It isn't Dobby." At that moment, the small creature huddled in the corner, a house elf, peeked out from behind its trembling fingers. Half of its wide eye appeared, staring directly at Harry. In a high, quavering voice, it piped up, "Sir, did you just call me Dobby?" Harry started. The elf's tone was so piercingly shrill that he suddenly wondered if it might be female. It was impossible to tell by appearance alone. All the same, the other two spectators in the box turned their heads in unison, their curiosity suddenly fixated on this tiny intruder and its exchange with the famous boy who lived. Outside, the roar of the crowd ebbed and flowed as the teams warmed up, but up here everything fell silent. "Oh, please forgive me," Harry said, forcing a smile at the trembling elf. "I simply thought you were someone I once knew. His name was Dobby." The elf stiffened, then squeaked indignantly, "But I know Dobby too, sir." It stamped one scrawny foot. "He's a dear friend of mine." Sherlock cleared his throat, folding his hands on his lap. Beside him, Harry offered a conciliatory nod to the indignant house elf. "Well then," he said softly, "let's introduce ourselves. I'm Harry Potter, and this is—" Before he could finish, the atmosphere in the box grew even tensely still, as though the very walls were holding their breath. All three occupants, two wizards and one rather aggrieved house elf, were now locked in mutual scrutiny. And somewhere deep in Harry's pocket, his phone vibrated. A message from the Minister of Magic warning him to keep a low profile. What could possibly go wrong next? Winky crouched inside the crate, her hands shielding her eyes, as though the lantern's gentle glow were blinding. "My name is Winky, sir. Sir, you are." She froze, her gaze drifting to the jagged scar on Harry's forehead. In an instant, her big brown eyes widened. "I know you, sir. You must be Harry Potter." Harry gave a calm nod. After a day of startling encounters, this reaction felt almost routine. "Yes." "Oh dear." Winky's voice trembled with excitement. She lowered her hands slightly, fingers splayed. "Dobby talks of you day and night, of you, sir, and of that remarkable gentleman who can read minds." Sherlock Holmes, standing at Harry's side, couldn't suppress a small smile. "Isn't Dobby still at Hogwarts?" Winky gasped, pressing her hands back to her cheeks as though shielding her thoughts. "Mind reading, sir? I don't have that ability," Sherlock said, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. He shifted his tone, as if the matter were already closed. "Let's talk about Dobby instead. What's he doing now?" Winky's head shook in gentle denial. The faded linens of her house elf robes rustled softly. "He's still at Hogwarts. The other house elves are keeping watch over him, so he can't return to his former master. But I don't think he truly wants to go back. If he did, he would have slipped away by now." Sherlock turned to Harry, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Exactly. That's why I suggested you use creature instead of Sirius. Even with a binding magical contract, a clever house elf will always seek out loopholes and opportunities to bend the rules." "Oh my," Winky gasped, her small frame trembling. "Dobby was right. You really can read minds." Sherlock gave her a reassuring nod, but didn't linger on the topic. He studied her for a moment. Her shoulders were stiff with unease, then asked, "All right, Winky, you've told us about Dobby, but what brings you here?" "You look like you're afraid," Sherlock remarked. Winky's eyes darted to the top edge of the box, and she swallowed audibly. I suffer from acrophobia," she admitted in a trembling voice. "But if Master commands me to the top box, I shall obey, sir." Sherlock turned to Hermione, who was sitting beside him. She met his gaze for a moment. He had helped her conquer much of her fear of heights, but recalling those very exercises still made her cheeks burn. She quickly looked away. "He knows you're scared," Sherlock said softly. "So why would he send you up there?" Harry frowned, his displeasure unmistakable. He hated seeing a house elf treated so harshly, especially one as gentle and nervous as Winky. Master wants me to reserve him a seat, Harry Potter," Winky explained, her small voice quivering. "He's far too busy to come himself." She cocked her head toward the row of empty velvet benches, her eyes shining with quiet sorrow. "Winky truly wishes she could return to Master's tent, Harry Potter." "Winky will obey Master's orders. Winky is a very good house elf." She finished her sentence, then shot a frightened glance toward the carriage door. With a tiny squeak, she covered her eyes with trembling hands and curled into a tight ball. Ron nudged Harry and whispered, still fidgeting with the omnioculars, "If you think she's odd, Wait until you meet Dobby or Creature." Harry frowned, watching the elf quake. "I wish I knew whose servant she is." "The head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation, Barty Crouch," Sherlock answered coolly. "What?" Harry blinked. "Didn't you ask? There's your answer. She belongs to Mr. Crouch." "Oh my!" Winky peered out between her fingers, awe in her voice. "She never said a word. Sir really can read minds." In the cramped compartment, no one batted an eye at Sherlock's uncanny knowledge. Bill and Charlie simply nodded, unconcerned by the how. Only Mr. Crouch himself sat perfectly still, expression unreadable, the elf's revelation hanging in the air. Arthur Weasley tapped his chin thoughtfully and murmured, "So it was Barty after all. That's so like him, precise in every detail, even dispatching a house elf to reserve our seats." The mention of house elves hung in the air for a moment, then Ron couldn't contain himself any longer. He whipped out his omnioculars, fiddled with the focus, and trained them on the opposite side of the stadium. Grinning, he twisted the replay dial. "Brilliant. Watch this. Now he'll pick his nose again, and again, and again." Ginny wrinkled her nose and shot Ron a disgusted look. "Honestly, Ron, that's gross." She scooted over to sit as far from him as she could. Meanwhile, Hermione reached into her bag and pulled out the match program, a little velvet booklet trimmed with tassels. She lovingly stroked its cover before opening it. Her eyes skimmed the page until they suddenly lit up. "Guys, look at this." She cleared her throat and read aloud, "There's going to be a team mascot performance before the match starts." "Oh, I always love the mascots," Arthur said with a warm smile, setting down his pumpkin juice. A faraway gleam of nostalgia flickered in his eyes. Ron, Ginny, Hermione, and Arthur exchanged excited glances. The match was still minutes away, but already the day promised more magic and more fish than any of them had bargained for. "When I was a kid, the World Cup's mascot show was the highlight for me," Sirius said, turning to Harry with a nostalgic grin. "Each national team brings its rarest magical creatures to perform, seriously unforgettable. I saw it once when I was small, and I still remember every moment." Slowly, the VIP box began to fill. Mr. Weasley moved down the row of seats, shaking hands with one distinguished wizard after another. Today, he wisely kept Harry and the children out of the introductions, something Harry silently appreciated. He was frankly tired of the endless stares at his lightning bolt scar. Hermione leaned toward Sherlock. "That's Minister Archibald Pye over there, and next to him is Delphine Skoll, head of Scotland's Auror Office." Sherlock gave a slight nod and in a low voice filled in their titles and latest exploits. Everyone edged closer to listen, everyone except Ron and Percy. Ron was utterly absorbed in his omnioculars, oblivious to everything but the view through the lenses. If you looked over his shoulder, you'd have thought he was watching an old man picking his nose. Percy, meanwhile, tensed himself at every new arrival, springing to his feet with a stiff, overly polite smile, as if competing for the Best Greeter award. Percy sat as though on a bed of needles. Every time he moved, a fresh discomfort shot through him. When Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, finally swept into the room, Percy snapped into an exaggerated bow so deep that his horn-rimmed glasses flew off, clattering to the floor. The lenses shattered instantly. Mortified, he raised his wand and mended them with shaking fingers, then sank back into his seat, cheeks burning. To his dismay, Fudge never even glanced his way. Instead, the minister crossed directly to Sirius Black and Harry Potter. Percy understood why Sirius commanded such attention. After all, he was a recipient of the Order of Merlin, first class, and Percy owed him for those omnioculars he'd been gifted. But Harry? Percy felt a flicker of bitterness. He had worked tirelessly at the ministry, top marks at Hogwarts, years of conscientious internship, yet had never drawn a fraction of the minister's interest. All Harry had to do was show up, and Fudge fawned over him like he was royalty. Percy's gaze lingered on Harry, envy and resentment knotting in his chest. It seemed that no amount of dutiful service could match the simple power of being the boy who lived. Cornelius Fudge strode confidently over to Sirius Black and offered him a broad, warm handshake. Then, as if he were a doting father eager to show off his son, he turned to Harry, clasped his hand, and began chattering animatedly about all that had happened to the boy in recent weeks. Spotting a lone wizard in luxurious robes standing nearby, Fudge guided Harry toward him and announced in a voice loud enough for everyone around to hear, "Minister Kavalov, may I present Harry Potter?" He beamed at the wizard, who, as everyone would later learn, was the Bulgarian Minister for Magic, and continued, brimming with excitement, "Harry Potter, sir. You simply must know who he is. He's the boy who survived you-know-who. Surely you've heard of him by now?" The Bulgarian minister was dressed in a black velvet robe trimmed in gold, the collar fastened with jewel-encrusted buttons. He tilted his head and frowned, clearly not understanding a word of English, but gave a polite smile and a nod. Just as Fudge looked ready to go on, the minister's gaze fell to the lightning-shaped scar on Harry's forehead. His eyes instantly lit up. Pointing at the scar, he began to babble rapidly in Bulgarian, his voice trembling with excitement. I knew I'd get him to understand eventually. Cornelius Fudge exhaled in relief and turned to Harry with a wry grin. Honestly, I'm hopeless with languages. Whenever something like this comes up, I wish I had Barty Crouch at my elbow. Ah, there he is. His house elf's already saved him a seat. Very thoughtful, aren't they? Those Bulgarians always find a way to hog the best spots. A low, unexpected chuckle drifted over from a few seats away. Harry tensed. Even in the crowded box, the sound rang out with remarkable clarity. "Holmes, was it?" Fudge called, his tone edged with impatience. "What's so amusing?" Sherlock Holmes's lips curved in mild amusement, but he offered no immediate answer. Fudge's brow furrowed. He still refused to believe that this boy had, months earlier, untangled the web behind Sirius Black's false accusation. No, Fudge was convinced Dumbledore had orchestrated the whole affair to turn the wizarding world's attention to his chosen protégé, just as he'd done so many times before. Hermione Granger, seated nearby, suddenly leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Sherlock, do you speak Bulgarian as well?" In an instant, every head in the box turned toward Sherlock. Fudge visibly brightened at the prospect. If this schoolboy really could translate, he'd be invaluable. Why, the boy should consider it a great privilege to be of service to the Minister for Magic. Sherlock leaned back in his chair, surveying the assembled witches and wizards with mild amusement. "My dear Hermione, I assure you, I did not lie. Bulgarian is not one of the languages I speak." Hermione's arms snapped to her sides. "See? I told you." Before Fudge could open his mouth to protest, Sherlock raised a hand. "That hardly matters. It doesn't mean we cannot converse with our Bulgarian colleague. Am I mistaken, sir?" He nodded toward the Minister for Magic from Bulgaria. Fudge shot him a sharp look. "Sherlock, what are you talking about? He doesn't understand English." Mr. Weasley cleared his throat. Otherwise Cornelius wouldn't have struggled so badly to relay messages yesterday. Sherlock's expression remained unruffled. "I'm telling you, he does speak English." A sudden hush fell over the chamber. All eyes shifted to the Bulgarian minister, whose brow furrowed in genuine perplexity. He glanced from Sherlock to Fudge, as if unsure why he had become the focus of such debate. Fudge's lips tightened. "Holmes, this is no time for jokes." Sherlock offered a calm, knowing smile, one that suggested the truth behind his words was more intriguing than any jest. "I'm not joking, Minister." Sherlock Holmes met Cornelius Fudge's incredulous stare with cool intensity. "This gentleman not only speaks perfect English, he also found your pantomime rather entertaining." Fudge sputtered. "Enter. How could?" Before he could finish, the Foreign Minister of Magic stepped forward, his immaculate London accent cutting through the commotion. "Fascinating young wizard. And what shall I call you?" "Holmes." Sherlock inclined his head. "Holmes. Sherlock Holmes." The Bulgarian minister offered a hand, his earlier confusion replaced by a wry smile. "A pleasure, Mr. Holmes. I'm Minister Oblonsk." Only then did Fudge register the truth. His eyes went wide. "You speak English, yet you kept me waving my arms and pretending the whole day." Oblonsk shrugged as if discussing the weather. Like Mr. Holmes said, it was quite amusing. He turned back to Sherlock with genuine curiosity. "But how did you deduce my language skills? I never uttered a single word of English until just now." Chapter 475, The Most Beautiful Woman. "Minister, you didn't speak a single word of English," Sherlock observed quietly, his cool gaze fixed on Minister Obolonsk, Bulgaria's Minister for Magic. Obolonsk looked back, expression inscrutable. Sherlock continued in a low, measured tone, "But human reactions often betray far more than words ever could. When Minister Fudge introduced Harry Potter, the boy who survived you-know-whose curse, you immediately stared at Harry's lightning bolt scar. He paused, letting his words sink in, and swept his eyes across the spectators in the royal box. A murmur rippled through the crowd as they realized the truth. If Obelansk had truly failed to grasp Fudge's English, he wouldn't have reacted so swiftly or decisively. Hermione leaned forward, her rosy cheeks betraying both admiration and excitement. This was the Sherlock she knew, the Sherlock who turned subtle observation into incontrovertible proof. Sherlock's voice dropped even lower as he addressed the Bulgarian minister once more. Your gaze wasn't mere curiosity, it was recognition. And your deliberate gesture, pointing straight at the scar without a hint of confusion or uncertainty, confirms you fully understood exactly who Harry Potter is. A tense silence followed. All eyes were on Obelansk, awaiting his response now that Sherlock's deduction had laid bare his true understanding. Yet for a moment, the Bulgarian minister remained as inscrutable as ever, caught between diplomatic reserve and the undeniable truth Sherlock had unveiled. Someone who truly didn't understand English wouldn't have lit up the moment I began speaking, Sherlock observed coolly. And when Minister Fudge resorted to elaborate pantomime a moment ago, your expression never flickered. No sign of confusion or panic, just amused detachment. A real language barrier would have left you fidgety, your eyes darting around in desperation. Those little tells are enough to prove that you were enjoying this prank from the start. He fell silent, letting his words settle in the tense air. Then Obelansk threw back his head and laughed, the polished London accent slipping through the carefully maintained Bulgarian affectation. Brilliant, simply brilliant. He slapped Sherlock on the shoulder, utterly unfazed by Fudge's scowl. All right, I confess it, I was just teasing him. Honestly, watching the Minister for Magic of a great nation wave his arms around like a stage performer, that spectacle was worth every second. Holmes, you know what? You'd be perfect for the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Barty Crouch needs someone like you, the announcer declared. Cornelius Fudge's cheeks flamed as he spun away, muttering something about crass impoliteness. Sherlock Holmes simply sighed. In the Muggle world, heads of state often spoke entirely different languages during formal summits, and even when they understood one another, they still delivered speeches in their native tongues, relying on translators. As the critic Lyndon once noted, good manners demand that you speak in your own language and let an interpreter handle the rest. Yet here, neither the British Ministry of Magic nor its Bulgarian counterpart had provided a single translator. One could only marvel at how self-assured and perhaps overconfident the entire magical world had become. Just then, a cluster of latecomers bustled into the royal box, offering Fudge an unspoken reprieve from further embarrassment. "Ah, Lucius Malfoy!" Fudge exclaimed, as though greeting an old friend after a long absence. Sherlock raised an eyebrow and followed Fudge's gaze. There, in the second row of the box seats, directly behind Cornelius Fudge, sat the Malfoy family, their pale faces and immaculate robes unmistakable amid the gathered dignitaries. The Weasleys' box remained unoccupied, its seats now apparently held for the Malfoys. Sherlock had already met Lucius and Draco Malfoy, each looked just as he remembered, but this was his first glimpse of the third member of the family, Lucius's wife and Draco's mother, Narcissa Malfoy. Her skin was as pale as porcelain, and her light blonde hair was so fair she might have passed for Lucius's sister rather than his spouse. Yet in her carriage she bore all the hallmarks of the House of Black, statuesque height and an almost ethereal beauty. At that moment, however, her expression was clouded by a faint look of distaste, as though she had caught an unpleasant odor. "Ah, Minister Fudge, good evening," Lucius called, striding past Cornelius Fudge and extending his gloved hand. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Narcissa, and our son, Draco." "Hello, hello," Fudge replied with an ingratiating grin, bowing toward Narcissa. "And this is Minister Oberlansk. No, wait. Obelansk? I'm always mangling that. He's the Minister for Magic of Bulgaria, and he's been pretending not to understand English, just to tease me." Fudge's sheepish smile showed he'd finally mastered the name, at least for the moment. Minister Fudge leaned back in his chair, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Well, Minister Obelansk, I wasn't serious, just having a bit of fun." Obelansk, the Bulgarian Minister for Magic, stiffened at first. His cheeks colored slightly as he hastily replied, "Oh no, nothing to worry about. Just a casual remark, really." Fudge's grin widened at the display of discomfort. To break the tension, Obolonsk rose, stepped forward, and courteously drew Narcissa Malfoy's hand into his own. He bent his head and pressed a gentle kiss to her gloved fingers. "A pleasure to meet you, Lady Malfoy. I trust I can count on your support for Bulgaria's cause." Narcissa inclined her head with perfect poise. "The pleasure is mine, Minister." Standing by his wife's side, Lucius Malfoy couldn't help but straighten his posture, a faint puff of pride in his chest. His wife's flawless manners reflected well on him, and that was not lost on Sherlock Holmes, who quietly observed the exchange from across the room. Sherlock filed away the subtle cues of the Malfoys' relationship, noting the ease with which Lucius beamed at Narcissa's graciousness. Clearing his throat, Fudge turned to Lucius with renewed enthusiasm. "And now, Lucius, you must know our next guest, Mr. Sirius Black, of course. He's the one who helped us unmask the traitor feeding information to you-know-who," Minister Fudge declared with a flourish. Lucius Malfoy's smile stiffened at the announcement. Sensing her husband's sudden chill, Narcissa Malfoy placed a reassuring hand on Lucius's arm and stepped forward to address Sirius. "Sirius, it's been far too long." "Indeed, cousin," Sirius Black replied with a courteous nod. His tone was measured, betraying no surprise or warmth. Narcissa, née Black, was his cousin on his father's side, just like Bellatrix, though the two had followed very different paths. Sirius had always regarded Narcissa as a distant relative, untouched by the darker loyalties that bound Bellatrix to Voldemort. Fudge moved on with equal briskness. "And this is Arthur Weasley," he announced, gesturing to the bespectacled man beside him. "I'm sure you know him. His children are all at Hogwarts." An uncomfortable hush fell over the Malfoy box at the mention of the Weasley name. The Malfoys exchanged taut glances, and even Narcissa's gentle reassurance to her husband did little to ease the tension. Compared to the polite frostiness that greeted Sirius's arrival, the air now crackled with an altogether sharper edge. With the exception of Sherlock, everyone who knew the full story exchanged helpless glances at Fudge. He really did have a knack for bringing up the most awkward subjects. Arthur Weasley and Lucius Malfoy sat opposite one another in the VIP box, their eyes meeting in a tense silence. Sherlock hadn't witnessed this tension firsthand, but Harry remembered it all too clearly. Their last encounter had unfolded at Flourish and Blots. A skirmish broke out among the aisles of spellbooks, and in the chaos, Malfoy had slipped Voldemort's diary right into Gilderoy Lockhart's pile of purchases. Oblivious, Lockhart later carried the diary into Hogwarts, unlay, ashing a storm of panic when it was revealed to be a Horcrux. That day, Lucius Malfoy's greeting to Mr. Weasley had been anything but polite. His cold gray eyes swept over Arthur's threadbare robes and modest possessions. With a soft, mocking drawl, he had murmured, "Good heavens, Arthur. Pray tell, what did you have to sell to afford these box seats? Your belongings can't be worth that much, can they?" Even without that incident, the Malfoys' disdain for the Weasleys was hardly new, and the atmosphere in the box crackled with the unspoken history between them. In the eyes of most pure-blood families, everything the Weasleys did was a disgrace. Unfortunately, Fudge didn't catch Lucius's meaning and continued merrily. "Arthur, Lucius here has just made a generous donation to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. He's an honored guest I invited." "Oh, how splendid," Mr. Weasley replied with a polite, strained smile. At that moment, Malfoy's cool gaze swept over Sherlock and Hermione. His brow tightened, and Hermione felt her face flush, but she held his stare without looking away. The Malfoys had always taken great pride in their pure-blood heritage. Narcissa Black had only reinforced that sense of superiority once she married Lucius. Mixed bloods were bad enough in their eyes, and Muggle-borns like Sherlock and Hermione were even lower on the social scale. Still, with the Minister for Magic standing by, Lucius held his tongue. He offered Weasley a thin, sarcastic nod before turning away and taking his seat. Narcissa gave Sirius a slight nod and eased into her seat. Draco arranged himself primly between his parents. "That's odd," Ron Weasley murmured to Harry, eyeing the Malfoys. "You'd think that insufferable brat would have started something by now." "He's been unusually quiet," Sherlock Holmes observed, his gaze lingering on the trio. From their body language alone, he'd already pieced together far more than they suspected. Before anyone could reply, Ludo Bagman swept into the VIP box like a gust of wind. His round, cheese-wheel face positively glowed as he addressed Minister Fudge. "Is everyone ready?" "Minister, shall we begin?" Cornelius Fudge gave a genial nod. "By all means, Ludo." Without another word, Bagman drew his wand, cast a charm on his voice, and assumed his familiar role as commentator. "Ladies and gentlemen, witches and wizards, welcome to the 422nd Quidditch World Cup." Bagman's thunderous announcement rolled over the stadium, echoing from one end of the stands to the other. The moment he finished, the crowd exploded into cheers and applause, the roar of excitement rippling through the night air. Thousands of flags fluttered in unison, while a medley of national anthems cascaded across the stadium, creating an electrifying atmosphere. On the giant scoreboard opposite Sherlock, the temporary GG message blinked off, replaced by the simple scoreline, Bulgaria versus Ireland, 0-0. The sponsor's opening fireworks, GG time, had drawn to a close. Now at last, the real spectacle was about to begin. According to Hermione's deft reading of the match protocol, each side would send out a mascot troupe before the first whistle. "I'm your commentator for tonight's match, Ludo Bagman," crackled over the PA. "Let's cut to the chase, introducing the mascot of the Bulgarian national team." A ribbon of crimson unfurled along the far-right stands, and fans rose in a sudden roar of approval. Mr. Weasley leaned forward, practically vibrating with excitement. "I wonder what they've got lined up." He raised a finger to push off his spectacles, then, eyes widening, tore them off and hastily polished the lenses against his robes. "Good heavens! Vila!" Harry, puzzled, turned to him. "Vila?" No sooner had he asked than 100 of them drifted onto the pitch, moving with the lithe grace of dancers. Their hair rippled like moonlight, their eyes glittered with a strange, irresistible allure. In that instant, Harry understood. The Vila were not mere mascots, but creatures of fabled beauty and enchantment, their very presence electrifying the air. Harry had never seen more beautiful women in his life. It wasn't an exaggeration. They were so impossibly lovely they seemed unreal. Their skin glowed with a soft, moonlit radiance, and their hair drifted behind them as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. For a moment, Harry stood frozen, bewildered. What were they? Why did their skin gleam so purely? Why did their tresses float without wind? And most of all, why did they feel so achingly beautiful? He even caught himself feeling a strange flush of embarrassment. At that moment, Cho Chang didn't compare. Then the music began. All his questions vanished as the Vila launched into their dance. Harry's mind went completely blank, overtaken by a wave of exquisite pleasure. Nothing else mattered but watching their every move. If they stopped dancing, he felt certain something terrible would follow. Faster and faster they spun, their movements wild and hypnotic, and Harry's dazed thoughts spiraled into half-formed urges. "Keep going. Don't stop. Faster, faster. It's coming. It's almost here." In that charged instant, a single, all-consuming desire blazed through him. He had to do something grand, right now. He stepped out onto the narrow ledge of the press box, staring down into the cavernous stadium below. He didn't stop to ask himself why he wanted to jump, only whether it would be thrilling enough. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, came a familiar voice. "My dear friend, whatever are you doing?" Sherlock's unmistakable tone drifted up to him, cutting through the rush of adrenaline. Chapter 476, Sherlock Isn't Human. Sherlock's voice finally cut through the haze, yanking Harry back to full awareness, and at once he noticed the delicate, fairy-like music had stopped. He blinked in confusion and became painfully aware of how he was balanced, one leg propped against the wall of the VIP box, as though he'd been about to vault out into the stadium below. A few feet away, Ron lay frozen mid-dive, arms splayed like a springboard athlete, utterly motionless. They weren't the only ones incapacitated. Behind them, Draco Malfoy thrashed in Lucius and Narcissa's grip, his face contorted with fury. "Let me go! I want her! Now!" he snarled. Narcissa's eyes narrowed, she leveled her wand, and Draco's struggle went slack immediately. Lucius caught him before he could collapse completely. All around the box, teenage wizards, boys Harry's and Ron's age, were equally derailed, gripped by the same wild infatuation. The adult guests, though their expressions still held the ghost of ecstatic reverie, managed to restrain themselves. Outside these walls, however, the crowd in the stadium had reached a fever pitch, roaring and cheering with unbridled excitement. The stadium erupted in frustrated shouts as the crowd refused to see the Bulgarian Vila leave the field. Harry couldn't blame them. He, too, was firmly rooting for Bulgaria. After all, they had a Vila on their team. What did Ireland have? A few oversized shamrocks and a lot of hot air. He glanced down at the gaudy green shamrock pinned to his chest and wondered how he'd let himself be roped into it. Beside him, Ron was even worse. His fingers were tearing at the shamrock stuck to his sorting hat as he stared, mouth agape, at the Vila. Bill, Charlie, and the Weasley twins struggled to contain their amusement. Percy and Ginny, on the other hand, exchanged disapproving looks. "Falling head over heels won't win you the match, Ron," Ginny whispered. At that moment, Mr. Weasley, unable to stand it any longer, reached over and plucked the hat from his son's grip. With a fond smile, he said, "Easy now, Ronald. You'll need that shamrock later, when the Irish finally take to the pitch." Ron blinked, as though emerging from a trance, and grunted, still fixated on the Vila. But it was too late. The Bulgarian team had already lined up on the opposite side of the field, brooms at the ready. Hermione and Ginny each took one of Harry's arms and gently hauled him back to his seat, just as the referee's whistle cut through the roar of the crowd. Hermione clicked her tongue sharply. "Oh, so you're under their spell too?" Ginny rolled her eyes. "They're Vila, Hermione. Harry's already dancing. Just look at Ron." "But Sherlock didn't bat an eye, did he?" Hermione countered. All through the performance, she'd been watching their box, especially Sherlock, worried he'd fall under the Vila's charm, like Harry and Ron. Yet from the first enticing note to the final flourish, Sherlock simply admired the dancers with cool, appreciative eyes. When the music stopped, he remained as unflappable as ever. Fred and George were on the verge of jumping up to join in until Bill and Charlie grabbed each of them by the arm, pulling them back and instantly sobering them up. Even more surprising was Percy. He'd sat rigid throughout the entire act, brows knotted, fiercely resisting any urge to behave foolishly. Truly impressive restraint. At Hermione's remark, Ginny blurted out, "Oh, please, Harry's no match for Sherlock. He's not even human." Hermione burst into laughter. "Sorry, Sherlock." Ginny's cheeks turned pink. She'd meant no offense, but it was too late. Everyone in the box was already laughing, too. Her cheeks flamed as she hurriedly tried to explain herself to Sherlock. I didn't mean it like that. What I meant was, you're not exactly, well, human, no, not an ordinary person." Sherlock raised an eyebrow, but the corner of his mouth twitched into a small smile. "Please, Miss Weasley, there's no need to be so flustered. I understood what you were driving at. But let me clarify one thing. Resisting Avila's mesmerizing power demands more than iron will. It also requires prior mental preparation. Harry and Ron had neither, having never encountered Vila before. Their reactions were entirely predictable under the circumstances. Ginny exhaled in relief. "Thank you, Sherlock." Harry shifted his weight, embarrassment warming his cheeks. "Thank you?" Sherlock's eyebrow arched higher. "Don't mistake my leniency for excuses. On the contrary, I think you should have handled this far better." Harry's momentary relief evaporated. "Better?" Sherlock folded his arms, gaze steady and cool. "Yes. The instant you saw them, you ought to have recognized that sheer willpower wouldn't suffice. You needed a plan, some means of fortifying your mind in advance." Ginny bit her lip, and Harry looked down. There was simply no arguing with Sherlock once he'd settled on his point. "And Ron," Sherlock added coolly, "that stance of yours just now was abysmal." Harry and Ron both fell silent, exchanging awkward looks. Ginny, who'd been on edge, watched Sherlock's impromptu lecture and couldn't help but laugh. The tension she'd felt over Harry and Ron's self-righteous posturing and her own slip of the tongue, "Sherlock isn't human," dissolved in an instant. Just then, Ludo Bagman's booming voice crackled through the stadium speakers. "Now, everyone, please raise your wands. Let's welcome the official mascot of the Irish national team." Before anyone could blink, a massive green and gold sphere shot into the arena like a blazing comet. It circled the stadium once, then split into two smaller, glowing comets, each streaking toward its respective goalpost. Simultaneously, a perfect rainbow arched across the pitch, linking the twin lights. When the rainbow faded, the lights converged again into one, and there, hovering above the stands, was a colossal shamrock, shimmering and spinning in midair. But the next instant, something began to clatter down from above. No exaggeration. It was as if golden raindrops were pouring through the air, like beads spilling from a broken necklace. Galleons! Wow, that's incredible! Fred, George, and Ron whooped in delight. The huge shamrock hovering overhead spun slowly, showering the stands with heavy gold coins that pinged off heads and seats. From his vantage point, Sherlock's keen eyes caught the real secret. The shamrock wasn't a single enchanted leaf at all, but a swirling mass of tiny creatures. Each wore a scarlet waistcoat, sported a neat little mustache, and held a gleaming lantern, some gold, some green. "Ireland's leprechauns," he announced. Mr. Weasley, ever the enthusiastic commentator, bellowed over the roar of the crowd. Spectators sprang from their seats, some scrambling atop benches, others diving beneath them, to snatch up as many coins as they could. In that instant, any disappointment over the villa's earlier exit vanished entirely, eclipsed by the gleeful clamor of treasure raining from the sky. Ron scooped up a handful of gold coins, his grin widening. Sherlock couldn't help but smile. "Money and beauty, humanity's eternal pursuits," he observed. Hermione laughed. "Sherlock, that sounds a little crude." Sirius lowered his binoculars and chimed in, "How about we call them career and love instead?" Hermione's cheeks flushed bright red. She mumbled something under her breath and looked away. At that moment, the giant shamrock hovering above the pitch shimmered and dissolved into nothing. Dozens of leprechauns tumbled down, landing nimbly on the grass in neat rows, directly opposite the Bulgarian villa. The stadium, nestled between the two sides, crackled with anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice echoed through the stands, "the mascot performance has concluded. Please give a warm welcome to the Bulgarian national Quidditch team." Ludo Bagman strode onto the pitch, his voice booming as he introduced each player. With every name, the Bulgarian section erupted in cheers. By the time he reached the seventh announcement, the applause had swelled into a thunderous roar. "And now, let's welcome Victor Crumb!" The stadium trembled under the intensity of the fans' ovation, as if the very air itself was swept away by their enthusiasm. "Look, it's him, Victor Crumb!" Ron burst out from the commentator's box, pressing his omnioculars to his eyes. They'd seen Crumb's photo in the Bulgarian tent, but nothing prepared them for the real thing. Gaunt, dark-haired, a strongly hooked nose under two thick black eyebrows, and an intensity Hermione had once compared to a great eagle. Ron turned to Harry and Sherlock, eyes wide. "He's only 18. Can you believe it?" The stadium thundered its approval as the Bulgarian team took the field, but the cheers that greeted Crumb's entrance outshone them all. No sooner had the Bulgarians settled on their positions than the Irish squad strode out under an equally raucous welcome. Their fans roared, but attention shifted again the moment the 7 Irish players mounted their brooms, each a gleaming firebolt. At that instant, Harry's mind drifted back to a moment a year ago in Diagon Alley, the first time he'd ever laid eyes on a firebolt. The owner of Quality Quidditch Supplies stepped out onto the sidewalk and raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Listen up, folks. The Ireland International Club just snapped up 7 of these top-of-the-line broomsticks. Don't miss your chance. These are the hottest items of this World Cup." A year later, he found himself watching those very broomsticks soar across the pitch in the Quidditch World Cup final. If ever there was dramatic foreshadowing, this was it. Back in the stadium, Ludo Bagman's voice boomed over the PA system once more. "Now, ladies and gentlemen, our referee for today's match, flown all the way from Egypt, head of the International Quidditch Federation, and beloved by fans around the globe, Hassan Mustafa." A roar of cheers erupted as a short, wiry wizard in a gleaming gold robe, matching the stadium's color scheme, strode confidently onto the field. His thick, dark beard was unmistakably Middle Eastern, and those in the VIP boxes trained their binoculars only to catch a glimpse of the silver whistle tucked beneath it. Under one arm he carried a sturdy wooden case, and under the other his polished referee's broomstick. Setting the box down at midfield, Mustafa extended an arm in invitation, beckoning both team captains forward for the traditional pre-game handshake. The captains of the Bulgarian and Irish teams strode to the center of the pitch, locked eyes for a moment, and offered each other a polite handshake. Nothing about the exchange hinted at the fireworks to come, until referee Mustafa, having set a wooden box on the ground, suddenly raised his foot and kicked it open. In an instant, 4 balls shot skyward, the scarlet quaffle, 2 jet-black bludgers, and the tiny winged golden snitch. Even with Harry's razor-sharp vision, the snitch was gone almost before he'd seen it. The stadium erupted in gasps and cheers, the air crackled with excitement. Harry felt his pulse quicken. This truly was the world stage, where even the referee could throw in a surprise or two. Mustafa hopped onto his broomstick and blew his shining silver whistle. Simultaneously, 15 broomtails lifted off the ground, 5 chasers, 3 beaters, 2 keepers, and of course the seekers, all racing for position. The match was officially underway. Sherlock, for his part, left his omnioculars stowed. He didn't need them to sense the electric thrill weaving through the stands. It was, without question, the most prestigious sports final in the magical world, and it lived up to every expectation. The Irish team, mounted on gleaming firebolts, and the Bulgarians, led by their superstar seeker Victor Krum, tore through the sky at breathtaking speed. Chasers on both sides exchanged the quaffle so rapidly that commentator Ludo Bagman, perched high above the pitch, could barely keep up. He'd begin calling out a name, O'Connor, Lee, Dimitrov, Ivanova, only for the quaffle to have already changed hands again. Tricks that Hogwarts players struggled to master in practice looked effortless in the hands of these world-class athletes. Sherlock glanced across at his younger brother, Harry, who was utterly entranced by the match. Harry pressed his omnioculars so firmly against his glasses that they left faint dents on his nose. He twisted the slow-motion knob on the side and tapped the match analysis button on top, determined to catch every split-second maneuver. Sherlock couldn't help but smile. He lifted his own omnioculars and joined Harry in following the dizzying spectacle. Finally, the tool's value became clear. For example, 3 Irish chasers streaked forward in tight formation, with the center player just a body length ahead of his teammates, as they all converged on the lone Bulgarian opponent. Instantly, purple explanatory text lit up the screen, clarifying the maneuver. Chapter 477, Hermione Grows Up. The stadium hosting the Quidditch World Cup final throbbed with the roar of 100,000 wizards. Moonlight washed over the pitch, turning the grass into a rippling sea of emerald. At that moment, Sirius's gift, the omnioculars, finally lived up to their promise. No longer just Ron's toy for rewinding old matches and watching elderly wizards pick their noses, they became a precision instrument for tactical analysis. Harry raised the lenses to his eyes and activated the slow-motion scan. Instantly, the game's shifting currents snapped into focus. A line of violet text appeared in the eyepiece. Hawkhead attack formation. 3 chasers advance in an arrowhead formation, compressing defensive space and driving opponents back toward the hoops. Threat level, 4. Before Harry could finish reading, Ireland's 3 chasers had already sprung into action. Clad in green, they streaked through the night sky like arrows loosed from a bow, cutting precise arcs as they dove toward the Bulgarian goalposts. The stadium's din peaked, every fan rising to their feet in anticipation of a spectacular play. As the firebolts tore across the pitch, their astonishing speed set the air currents dancing, making the vibrant sideline flags flutter wildly. Suddenly, a new line of text shimmered before Harry's vision. Play. In this maneuver, the chaser feigns an upward drive to bait defenders into pursuit. At the last moment, he drops the quaffle down to a teammate. Invented by Soviet player Petrova Porskov in 1976, its success hinges on perfect timing to exploit split-second reactions. Harry watched, enthralled, as the Irish chaser clutched the scarlet quaffle and launched his broom skyward. Bulgaria's 2 chasers vaulted after him, convinced he was headed straight for the hoops. Just as he reached his apex and lifted his wrist to release the pass, a Bulgarian beater on the opposite flank tensed. Sensing a trick, the beater abandoned his post. With a sharp crack, he swung his bat, sending a bludger careening toward the ascending chaser. But the Irishman, well versed in the Porskov ploy, had anticipated this exact moment. He dove aside, yanking on his broom's handle and narrowly avoiding the speeding bludger. Freed from danger, he banked the quaffle downward into the hands of a waiting teammate. The Bulgarian chasers skidded to a halt, caught off guard, as the Irish side maintained possession. Harry couldn't help but marvel at the flawless execution of the Porskov ploy, and at how a well-timed feint could turn the tide in an instant. When the bludger came screaming toward him, he merely sidestepped with dancer-like grace, and in one fluid motion, sent the quaffle spiraling downward, pure textbook technique, as if he'd drilled it 1,000 times. The Porskov ploy was in full effect. From below, his teammate plucked the ball out of the air and lofted it in a perfect, high arc. In less than 3 seconds, it was back in the hands of another chaser, nestled deep in the hawkhead formation. Without a moment's hesitation, that chaser surged forward. The quaffle clutched against his chest, like an arrow let loose from a bow. Ahead of him, the Bulgarian keeper, distinguished by a gleaming golden headband, planted his feet shoulder-width apart, arms tensed and ready for the shot. But the Irish chaser held his nerve. At the very last second, he feinted a snap to the left. The keeper reacted instantly, lunging with outstretched arms, only to realize, too late, that he'd been deceived. The quaffle was still in the original chaser's hands, now calmly redirected to the right. As the keeper twisted back, the ball flew cleanly through the far hoop. Goal Ireland. In that instant, Ireland's chaser gave a deft flick of his wrist, and the quaffle whooshed precisely through the right-hand hoop. Goal. Troy scores, came the triumphant cry. Ludo Bagman, seizing the microphone, couldn't hide his excitement, his voice crackling with enthusiasm. 10-0. Ireland leads, and that, dear friends, is the first goal of the match. A wave of cheers swept the stadium. Emerald scarves and flags rippled as Ireland's supporters roared in celebration, yet even the Bulgarians applauded warmly. After all, spectacular play transcends team loyalties. Harry, eyes glued to his omnioculars, suddenly shouted, "What do you mean, 10-0? Levski had the quaffle." Sherlock glanced over his shoulder. "My dear Harry," he said with mild amusement, "that was 15 seconds ago." Sherlock shook his head with an amused smile and gave Harry's shoulder a reassuring pat. "Not yet, Harry. I'd skip the slow-motion replay for now." "Huh," Harry blinked up at him, confused. "Exactly," Sherlock confirmed. Hermione, who'd been watching over his shoulder, chimed in with enthusiasm. "Look at the pitch. You'll miss all the action if you keep it in slow-mo." Reluctantly, Harry lowered the omnioculars and glanced across the field, just as Ireland's chaser, Troy, rounded the goalpost. He was already flying in joyful circles, arms thrown wide, his green jersey gleaming in the moonlight. The referee, stationed at midfield, made no move to halt the celebration. After all, this was the first goal of the match, and both fans and officials were letting it slide without protest. Seizing the moment, the Irish team's mascots launched their own tribute. From the sidelines, a dozen tiny leprechauns rose into the air. Under the stadium lights, their golden dust sparkled like stardust as it swirled and coalesced, shimmering into an enormous, living shamrock that hovered above the pitch in a dazzling display of emerald pride. The detail on the pitch was astonishing. Each blade of grass showed its veins with crystal clarity, and you could even make out the tiny serrations along every edge. The Bulgarian players barely noticed, though their indifference only heightened the tension on the field. Across from them, Ireland's Vila mascots stood in a tight row, faces dark with displeasure as they glared at the leprechauns. Even in their anger, those ethereal features were impossible to look away from. Up in the VIP box, the atmosphere crackled with excitement. From the moment that first goal sailed into the net, everyone knew the match had truly begun. Sirius Black and Arthur Weasley slapped their thighs in delight, cheering at the top of their lungs. The rest of the Weasley clan picked up the chant in waves. "Brilliant! Well done! Absolutely sublime!" Hermione practically vibrated with joy. She grabbed Sherlock's arm with one hand and waved her other fist in the air, her cheeks flushed and eyes sparkling. Everyone around seemed swept up in the moment. Everyone, that is, except Harry. He sat rigid, jaw clenched, furious at himself. Missing the opening goal of the match, a blunder any seeker would kill to avoid, and yet he'd done it. "Don't worry, Harry," Ginny murmured, leaning in so that only he could hear. "The omnioculars are recording the entire match. After it's over, you can replay it at normal speed, or even in slow motion, and use all the analysis tools to break down every pass." Harry exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. He adjusted the speed back to real time and turned his full attention to the pitch. Sharing the private box with him were two of the finest Quidditch minds he knew, Charlie Weasley, Gryffindor's ace chaser and Quidditch Cup champion, and Sherlock Holmes, whose uncanny grasp of game theory had even Oliver Wood dreaming of adding him to the team. It didn't take long for the three of them to decode Bulgaria's tactics. Their chasers moved with machine-like precision, firing passes at perfect angles. High-arcing throws sailed cleanly over defenders' heads. Low, skidding chases threaded the quaffle between brooms with surgical accuracy. Every fake, feint, and feed was executed flawlessly. Watching them dominate the field, there could be no doubt their place in the World Cup final was earned, not gifted. Of course, in Quidditch as in life, talent only tells half the story, and neither Harry, Charlie, nor Sherlock believed for a second this match would be anything less than a fierce battleground. Although the Bulgarian team was undeniably strong, there was always someone stronger, another peak yet to be conquered. If Bulgaria's chasers were world-class, then Ireland's were superclass, like standing atop a 100-foot pole and taking an extra step forward. Each Irish chaser moved with such fluid precision that their brooms felt like extensions of their own bodies. Even more astounding was their silent coordination. Through positioning and the slightest shift in posture, they anticipated one another's routes, as though reading each other's minds. Together, their entire offensive system was simply flawless. From the commentator's booth, Harry's voice crackled through the speakers, his rose-shaped badge glinting as he announced, "Troy, Mallet, Moran! Troy, Mallet, Moran!" Even though he'd never seen them before today, Harry had their names down within minutes. And in the next 10 minutes, Ireland added 2 more goals with that same impeccable teamwork, stretching the scoreboard to 30-0 and sending the sea of green-clad fans into roaring approval. The Ireland Leprechauns, too, held nothing back in their performance, twirling and chanting with infectious energy. But the Bulgarian team, hungry to erase their deficit, wouldn't be outdone. Alongside their 3 relentless chasers, both beaters hurled themselves into the fray. At last, after pouring every ounce of strength into their swings, one beater sent a bludger screaming toward an Irish chaser. The impact was so punishing that the chasers were forced to break formation, twice, abandoning their carefully honed hawkhead attack. Seizing the opening, Bulgarian chaser Stefan Dimitrov charged forward. He slammed between 2 stunned Irish defenders, then cut inside the outstretched arms of the keeper. With a final thunderous strike, he drove the quaffle cleanly through the goal hoops. Stefan's triumphant roar echoed across the stands as Bulgarian fans, long drowned out by the Leprechaun's whistles, erupted into wild cheers. Even the Vila, Bulgaria's elegant mascots, leapt into celebration, their silver voices intertwining in joyous song. "Oh no, plug your ears," Mr. Weasley called from the commentary box, ducking instinctively as the Vila's melody swelled to a dazzling crescendo. Sirius Black, now one of the elder wizards on the sidelines, simply smiled, clearly amused by how the younger crowd, especially his godson Harry, was losing their composure over the Vila's performance. Harry, recalling Mr. Weasley's warning, obediently pressed his fingers into his ears and shut his eyes. Sherlock had encouraged him to seize this moment to strengthen his mental defenses, but Harry knew his willpower wasn't yet up to the task. Better not to risk distractions, he decided, so he blocked out every sight and sound of the Vila's enchanting dance. Sirius sighed softly, a flicker of regret crossing his features. If Harry wouldn't react, there wouldn't be any drama to enjoy. Then Harry felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. He lowered his hands and opened his eyes to find Ginny Weasley offering him a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Harry," she whispered. He blinked once, twice, and realized the Vila had concluded their routine and retreated to their assigned spots. A warm relief settled over him. "Thanks, Ginny," he murmured, letting himself finally breathe. With the distraction gone, Harry steeled himself and turned his full attention back to the Quidditch match, determined not to miss a single moment. Ludo Bagman, the match commentator, rattled off the lineup like someone reading a menu. Dimitrov, Levski, Dimitrov, Ivanova. Harry and Ron exchanged amused looks. They'd always thought their memories were unreliable, yet somehow they not only deciphered those tongue twisters, but matched each name to a player on the pitch. Then, with staggering volume, Bagman bellowed, Oh, my goodness. In an instant, the 100,000 spectators fell utterly silent. The whoosh of wind felt impossibly loud. Every eye swung skyward to the two seekers, Victor Krum of Bulgaria and Ian Lynch of Ireland. They were plunging through a swarm of chasers, their brooms moving so fast they left faint after-images against the turf, as though they might crash headlong onto the grass at any moment. Clearly, both had spotted the golden snitch. Harry raised his omnioculars, squinting to pick out the tiny, gleaming ball amid the chaos below. "I'm sorry, but I can't help with that." Hermione felt the faint outline of Sherlock's muscles through the fabric of his jersey. Of course, he'd noticed their brief touch. He was nothing if not keenly aware. Fortunately, everyone around them was glued to the Quidditch match overhead, so no one else seemed to have picked up on it. Still, Hermione's cheeks flamed so fiercely she was sure she'd give off enough heat to fry an egg. She dropped her gaze to the scuffed toes of her shoes, her vision swimming. I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice barely more than a thread. Too embarrassed to meet his eyes, she focused on the floor and silently repeated to herself, "It really wasn't on purpose this time."